Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable wherever you happen to be. Maybe you're already in bed, maybe you have a lamp on beside you, maybe you're sitting on a couch with something warm to drink and you are looking for a story that takes you somewhere completely different for a while. Tonight, we are going to New York City. But not the New York City most visitors know today. We're not going to stand in the middle of modern Times Square beneath enormous digital advertisements, while tourists take photographs and families line up for Broadway shows. We are not going to the version of West 42nd Street, filled with chain restaurants, bright storefronts, renovated theatres, security cameras, and crowds carrying shopping bags. We are going back about 40 years to a period when the same few hundred yards of Manhattan had a very different reputation. It is sometime in the middle of the 1980s. You have just stepped onto West 42nd Street. More specifically, you're standing on the section between 7th Avenue and 8th Avenue, close to Times Square and only a short walk from the Port Authority bus terminal. New Yorkers had a nickname for this stretch, the Deuce. It came from 42nd Street itself, and by the 1970s and 1980s, the name had become closely associated with the blocks around Times Square, where grindhouse cinemas, adult theatres, peep shows, cheap hotels, drug dealing, prostitution, hustling, and street crime had become part of everyday life. Historians of New York now describe the stretch between Times Square and the Port Authority as one of the central locations of the city's adult entertainment economy during those decades. Before we walk any farther, I want to ask you something. What time is it where you are right now, and where are you listening from? Maybe it is late at night where you live. Maybe you can hear traffic outside. Maybe there is a train somewhere in the distance, or maybe your street has already become completely quiet. If you feel like sharing it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I always find it interesting that people can be lying in completely different places, sometimes thousands of miles apart, while listening to the same story about the same street. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you enjoy spending a little time with the ordinary details of history, rather than only the wars, presidents, generals and famous speeches, you can subscribe and give the video a like. You do not need to interrupt what you're doing. Just remember it later if you decide this was worth staying for. Now let us return to 42nd Street. Imagine that it is around 10 o'clock at night. The first thing you need to understand is that the street is not empty. That would almost make it easier. There are people everywhere. Some are coming out of subway entrances. Others have arrived at the Port Authority bus terminal a block to the west. Some are heading toward hotels. Some are looking for a movie. Some are trying to sell something. Some appear to be doing nothing at all. Taxis move through the intersection. Buses grind past. Car horns cut through the sound of engines. Newspaper boxes sit along the sidewalk. Theatre marquees hang over storefronts. Signs advertise movies that would never appear on the billboards surrounding Times Square today. There is plenty of light. That is one of the strange things about the old Times Square. Danger did not necessarily arrive in darkness. Some of the most troubled parts of the neighbourhood were illuminated by neon signs, movie marquees, storefront lights, and enormous advertisements. You could see where you were going. You simply had to pay attention to who was walking beside you. If someone tried to imagine a dangerous American street without knowing anything about New York, they might picture an abandoned road with boarded windows and nobody around. 42nd Street was almost the opposite. Its danger came partly from how busy it was. There were enormous numbers of strangers passing one another at every hour. Tourists arrived from other parts of the country. Commuters crossed Midtown. Teenagers wandered in from the suburbs. People without permanent housing used the transportation terminals and theatres as temporary shelter. Sex workers looked for customers. Drug dealers looked for buyers. Pickpockets looked for distracted pedestrians. Hustlers looked for anyone unfamiliar enough with the neighbourhood to believe a story for 30 seconds. That mixture created an unusual environment. You could have a businessman walking toward the subway beside a teenager who had run away from home, beside a tourist from Ohio, beside a man selling drugs, beside an undercover police officer, and beside someone who had spent the afternoon sleeping through 3 movies because a theatre ticket was cheaper than a room. None of them necessarily knew anything about the others. They simply occupied the same sidewalk. And that is important, because the story of 42nd Street is often simplified into a story about criminals. It was more complicated than that. The street was full of people who worked there. Projectionists worked in the movie houses. Cashiers sat behind glass. Restaurant employees served inexpensive meals. Hotel clerks worked night shifts. Police officers walked patrol. Newsstand operators sold papers. Cleaners swept theatre floors. Bartenders served drinks. Ticket sellers dealt with customers. Delivery drivers unloaded boxes. Port Authority employees dealt with passengers coming and going at every hour. There were also people who deliberately visited the area because they liked it. The grindhouse theatres of 42nd Street had their own audiences and their own culture. They screened horror films, martial arts movies, exploitation pictures, action films, low-budget productions, foreign films and adult movies, sometimes running programs continuously so that a customer could enter in the middle of one film and remain through the next. By the 1970s, the great movie palaces on West 42nd Street had moved far down market from their earlier lives. The Skyscraper Museum's history of the district describes theatres and movie houses presenting action films, pornography and peep shows, while crime became a persistent problem that defeated repeated redevelopment efforts. That was the strange arrangement of the deuce. The buildings were reminders of one version of New York, while the businesses inside them belonged to another. Look upward for a moment. Behind the signs and dirty facades are old theatres. Real theatres. Some had opened when 42nd Street was one of the great entertainment streets in the world. This block had not been built to become infamous. Quite the opposite. Near the beginning of the 20th century, the arrival of theatres and the subway turned 42nd Street into a major entertainment district. Within roughly 15 years of the first subway reaching Times Square, both sides of the street between 7th and 8th Avenues contained an extraordinary concentration of theatres and businesses serving theatre crowds. During the Depression, many of those venues shifted toward movies as legitimate theatrical productions disappeared from much of the block. So if you stood there in 1984 and looked carefully enough, you were standing inside the remains of something that had once been grand. That fact matters, because 42nd Street did not begin as a slum and then become successful. Its story went the other direction first. It had money, it had theatres, it had enormous crowds, it had restaurants and hotels and entertainment, and then, over several decades, the economic conditions supporting that world changed. The theatres became cheaper, buildings deteriorated, businesses changed, the sex trade expanded, pornography became more visible, street crime became harder to control. And by the time we reached the 1980s, government officials were no longer asking whether something should be done about West 42nd Street. They were arguing about how much of it should survive. That is how far the reputation had fallen. I want you to picture something very ordinary now. Suppose you are visiting New York for the first time in 1984. You arrive by bus. You step out near 8th Avenue carrying a suitcase. There is no smartphone in your pocket. There is no map application showing you exactly where your hotel is. You cannot quietly check recent reviews of the block you're about to walk down. You might have a paper map. You might have an address written on a piece of paper. You might know that Times Square is nearby because everyone in America has heard of Times Square. So you begin walking east, and within minutes you understand that this is not the Broadway district you expected. A man may approach and offer you something. Another may try to direct you toward a business you had no intention of visiting. Someone may ask for money, someone else may offer drugs, another person may simply follow too closely for half a block. You keep moving. You learn very quickly not to stop for every stranger. You learn to watch the people around you without obviously staring at them. You learn that appearing uncertain can attract attention. For regular New Yorkers, many of these behaviours became routine. That does not mean everyone was attacked. Most people who passed through Times Square came and went without becoming the victim of a serious crime, but the possibility was present enough to affect behaviour. People chose particular subway entrances, they crossed streets, they walked faster, they kept wallets where they could feel them, they avoided arguments, they learned which places were merely shabby and which ones could become genuinely dangerous. And this was happening during a period when New York City as a whole was experiencing extraordinary levels of crime. A Citizens Crime Commission report on 1980 described that year's crime figures as the worst in the city's history at that point. New York set records for major crimes, and during the first half of 1980, its robbery rate was the highest among the 25 most populous American cities. Think about what that means for the atmosphere of the time. The fear surrounding 42nd Street did not exist in isolation. New Yorkers were already hearing about robberies, burglaries, assaults, and murders across the city. The subway system had its own reputation for danger. Graffiti-covered trains became visual symbols of urban decline. The city was still recovering from the fiscal crisis of the 1970s. Buildings had been abandoned in other neighbourhoods. Public services had struggled. The national press regularly used New York as an example of what people believed was going wrong with American cities. Then, sitting in the middle of Manhattan, surrounded by Broadway theatres, major office buildings, transportation hubs, and some of the most expensive real estate in the country, was 42nd Street. That contrast made the Deuce famous. If the same conditions had existed on an isolated industrial road, few outsiders would have cared. But this was Times Square. Millions of visitors knew the name. The New York Times had helped give the square its identity after moving into its tower at Broadway and 7th Avenue in 1904. New Year's Eve crowds had been gathering around the building since the early 20th century. The area had long promoted itself as the entertainment centre of New York, and only a short distance away people were walking past adult bookstores and worn movie houses, while police tried to manage prostitution, gambling, drug activity, theft, and other street offences. The problem was serious enough that between July 1979 and December 1980, trained observers working in cooperation with the New York Police Department systematically toured the Times Square area, recording the number, type and location of street offences. The effort, known as Operation Crossroads, was designed to help police understand how patrol patterns affected prostitution, gambling, and other low-level crime in the neighbourhood. That detail tells us something useful. Officials were not merely responding to newspaper headlines. They were trying to measure what was happening block by block. Where were the problems? At what time? What happened when officers were visible? What happened when they moved elsewhere? Could a neighbourhood like this be controlled through ordinary patrol? Those questions would become increasingly important as the decade continued. For tonight, though, stay on the sidewalk. You're still standing on West 42nd Street. A theatre entrance is ahead of you. The ticket price is cheap. The lobby's worn. Inside, the carpet has absorbed years of spilled drinks, cigarette smoke, damp clothing, and thousands upon thousands of shoes. The audience is nothing like the crowd arriving at a Broadway musical a few streets north. Some people are there because they genuinely want to see the film. Some are there because it is inexpensive. Some are looking for privacy in a public place. Some are conducting business that has nothing to do with the movie. Some are sleeping. The theatre staff understand all of this. The regular customers understand it too. The tourists may not. Outside, the businesses continue one after another. Adult theatres, arcades, fast food counters, cheap souvenir stores, liquor stores, bars, small restaurants, hotels that have seen better decades, places with signs promising things that are not described very carefully. The neighbourhood's adult entertainment economy was not a minor side business. By the late 20th century, Times Square had become the centre of Manhattan's pornography trade, with adult movie houses, bookstores, peep show arcades, and related businesses concentrated in and around the district. The Times Square Alliance traces this commercial shift back through the Depression and World War II, when struggling theatres increasingly turned toward cheaper entertainment and commercial sex became more visible in the neighbourhood. That history is one reason we have to be careful when talking about 42nd Street. There was no single moment when everything went bad. No mayor woke up one morning and discovered that the street had suddenly changed. The transformation happened gradually. A theatre stopped presenting stage productions. Another began showing inexpensive double features. A hotel stopped attracting respectable travellers and lowered its rates. A storefront changed tenants. Another theatre began showing adult films. A peep show arcade opened. A building owner stopped investing in repairs because the property was no longer worth the expense. Families avoided the area. Different customers replaced them. Businesses adapted to those customers. Property values changed. The reputation worsened. The worsening reputation drove away another group of customers. Each change made the next one easier. By the 1980s, the result was visible from the sidewalk. But there was another side to this that people sometimes forget. The juice was also extremely profitable for certain people. A rundown building can still produce money. A theatre showing cheap movies can still sell hundreds of tickets. A peep show arcade can collect quarters all day. Illegal businesses can earn enormous cash revenue. Drugs can be sold quickly in a place with thousands of strangers passing through. A person arriving at the Port Authority and disappearing into the crowd may be difficult to follow. A tourist carrying money is an opportunity. A teenager with nowhere to sleep is vulnerable. A man looking for something he does not want his family to know about is easy to manipulate. This was not simply urban decay in the sense of nothing happening. A great deal was happening. Money was moving constantly. The question was who controlled it, who benefited from it, and who paid the price. That is why calling 42nd Street merely dirty or run down does not explain enough. The street had an economy. It had routines. It had regular workers. It had predators. It had victims. It had rules that were understood by people who spent enough time there. It had police officers who knew particular faces. It had theatre employees who recognised customers. It had dealers who understood exactly where they could stand. It had sex workers who knew which hotels were usable and which customers looked dangerous. It had runaway teenagers learning lessons nobody wanted them to learn. It had tourists who occasionally walked one block too far west and suddenly realised that the postcard version of Times Square had disappeared. And it had city officials staring at maps and property records trying to decide how to remove all of this without destroying the theatre district around it. By 1984, New York City and New York State had formally adopted a major 42nd Street redevelopment project. The plans became one of the largest and most controversial urban redevelopment efforts in the country, involving proposed office towers, theatre preservation, demolition, public improvements, and extensive use of government power to change the district. Contemporary accounts show that supporters described redevelopment as a response to a crime-plagued area, while opponents feared that rebuilding Times Square on such a large scale would erase part of New York's character. That argument will continue for years. But there is something we need to understand before we get anywhere near the cleanup. We need to understand why this particular street reached this condition in the first place. Because if you only look at 42nd Street in the middle of the 1980s, the decline seems almost impossible. You're surrounded by Manhattan real estate. Grand Central Terminal is farther east on the same street. The New York Public Library is nearby. Broadway is beside you. Major hotels and office buildings are within walking distance. Millions of people pass through Midtown. How does a stretch of property in one of the busiest parts of one of the richest cities in the world become so difficult to control that government planners eventually decide ordinary improvements are no longer enough? To answer that, we have to leave our 1980s sidewalk for a while. We have to go back to the period when the theatres were new, when the crowds arriving on 42nd Street dressed for an evening out, when theatre owners competed to build bigger and more elaborate houses, and when almost nobody looking at those bright marquees could have imagined what would eventually operate behind the same doors. Because the dangerous 42nd Street of the 1980s was built inside the remains of a successful entertainment district, and the first real clues to what happened were already appearing decades before anyone began calling this block the Deuce. To understand how West 42nd Street became the place we encountered in the 1980s, we have to begin with a fact that can be difficult to believe when you look at photographs of the Deuce covered in adult theatre signs and worn storefronts. This street had once been one of the most fashionable entertainment addresses in the United States. Go back to 1904, and the neighbourhood does not even have the name Times Square yet. The intersection of Broadway, 7th Avenue and 42nd Street was known as Longacre Square. The New York Times was preparing to move into a new skyscraper there, and publisher Adolph Ochs persuaded the city to rename the area. The Times building opened that year, the subway reached the intersection, and Times Square began developing rapidly into the centre of New York's theatre business. Imagine arriving there around 1910. You would still recognise the geography. Broadway crosses 7th Avenue. 42nd Street runs east and west. Crowds pour from subway entrances. Almost everything else feels different. Men wear coats and hats. Women arrive dressed for an evening performance. Carriages and early automobiles move through traffic. Electric advertisements have begun covering buildings. Restaurants compete for theatre customers. Hotels serve travellers who have come to Manhattan specifically to spend money. Most importantly, theatres are appearing everywhere. The transformation was extraordinarily fast. By the years immediately before World War I, much of New York's legitimate theatre business had migrated north toward Times Square. The subway helped make that possible. The Times Square station handled nearly 5 million passengers during its first year of operation in 1905. An additional subway, elevated railway and bus connections eventually made West 42nd Street one of the easiest places in Manhattan to reach. And if you owned a theatre, that was exactly what you wanted. You wanted crowds. You wanted people arriving from downtown, uptown, Brooklyn, Queens, New Jersey, and the growing suburbs, so theatre owners built. The Republic Theatre opened on West 42nd Street in 1900. The New Amsterdam opened in 1903. The Lyric, the Liberty, the Empire, and other houses helped turn the blocks around Broadway into an entertainment district of remarkable density. The New Amsterdam gives us a particularly useful example because its history almost follows the history of the street itself. When it opened, it was an elaborate legitimate theatre. Beginning in 1913, it became closely associated with Florence Ziegfeld and the Ziegfeld Follies. Audiences came to see lavish productions featuring music, comedy, elaborate costumes, and some of the most famous performers of the period. The building represented exactly what 42nd Street wanted to be: expensive, fashionable, crowded, and modern. That is the 42nd Street worth keeping in your mind as we move forward. Because when the decline comes, the buildings do not disappear. They remain standing. The balconies remain. The decorated ceilings remain. The marble staircases remain. The dressing rooms remain backstage. What changes is the business taking place inside them. During the 1920s, Broadway theatre reached an extraordinary peak. Preservation historians estimate that by 1927 and 1928, the Times Square Theatre District had around 70 theatres and approximately 250 shows competing for audiences. The neighbourhood was not only an entertainment centre, it was an industry employing actors, musicians, stagehands, producers, ushers, ticket sellers, restaurant workers, hotel employees, advertisers, costume makers, and many others whose livelihoods depended on people continuing to buy tickets. Then the economy collapsed. The stock market crash of 1929 did not destroy 42nd Street overnight, but it changed the arithmetic of operating a theatre. When families lose income, theatre tickets become easy expenses to eliminate. Producers cannot keep expensive shows running without audiences. Actors lose work. Companies close. Theatre owners still have mortgages, taxes, maintenance costs, electricity bills, and hundreds or thousands of seats that need to generate money somehow. At the same time, another form of entertainment was becoming increasingly difficult for live theatre to compete against. Motion pictures, especially talking pictures. A movie did not require a full company of performers to appear on stage every night. Once the film existed, it could be projected again and again. Ticket prices could be lower. Programs could run continuously. A customer could enter at 2 in the afternoon or 10 at night. The Depression devastated legitimate theatre across the country. By the early 1930s, live companies were closing. Vaudeville was losing ground to movies and radio, and many theatrical buildings were being converted into cinemas, simply because film offered owners a way to keep their doors open. West 42nd Street adapted faster than almost anyone might have expected. By 1934, nearly all of the legitimate theatres on the block had shifted away from traditional stage productions. Some became movie houses, others experimented with burlesque and cheaper forms of entertainment. The New Amsterdam itself became a movie theatre in 1937, and would not host another live theatrical performance for 60 years. The Republic Theatre changed even more dramatically. In 1932, Billy Minsky took control of it and opened a striptease house there. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia later banned burlesque in 1937, after which the building became the Victory Theatre and spent decades showing motion pictures. Much later, during the worst years of 42nd Street's decline, it would become the first XXX-rated movie theatre on the block. Notice what is happening. The street is not emptying, it is changing customers. That distinction explains much of what happens later. A completely abandoned entertainment district would probably have been demolished or redeveloped much earlier. 42nd Street remained busy. People were still buying tickets. Businesses were still collecting money. Subways were still delivering enormous numbers of passengers. The Port Authority bus terminal would eventually open nearby in 1950, adding another constant stream of travellers. The neighbourhood retained one of the most important things any commercial district can have: foot traffic. What it gradually lost was the kind of foot traffic its older businesses had been designed to attract. World War II complicated the picture further. Times Square became an important gathering place for servicemen travelling through New York. Soldiers and sailors on leave looked for restaurants, bars, theatres, dancing, companionship, and sexual entertainment. Businesses responded to that demand. The district remained economically active, but prostitution and other forms of commercial sex became increasingly visible. The war also restricted construction, which meant aging buildings received fewer major improvements while their interiors continued to wear down. This is why photographs of Times Square during the 1940s can be misleading. You see enormous crowds, you see illuminated signs, you see servicemen, you see movie theatres, you see celebrations like VJ Day in 1945. It does not look like a dying neighbourhood, and in many ways it was not one yet. The New York Public Library's history of Times Square notes that the district maintained much of its glamorous reputation through the Depression and World War II, even while bawdier businesses became increasingly established. The problem was that the economic changes underneath that glamour did not reverse when the war ended. By the 1950s, officials were already trying to limit businesses they considered undesirable. They did not have much success. Think about why. A city can pass regulations against a particular activity, but it cannot easily order a neighbourhood to attract wealthier customers. It cannot force a successful Broadway production into a theatre whose owner makes more money showing movies. It cannot simply declare that a cheap hotel must become expensive, and it cannot eliminate prostitution or underground gambling merely by announcing that those things are unwanted. As legitimate theatre concentrated on the better houses north of 42nd Street, the movie theatres on the Deuce increasingly competed on price and volume. That gave rise to the Grindhouse. The name came from the practice of grinding through films continuously. A theatre might open in the morning and keep showing pictures until late at night. Instead of buying a ticket for a carefully scheduled evening performance, you paid a small amount and entered whenever you wanted. This made the theatres useful for people who had very different reasons for being there. A labourer could watch several movies cheaply. A teenager could spend hours inside. Someone trying to escape winter weather could remain warm. A person without secure housing could sleep in a seat. A pickpocket could work through a dark auditorium. Someone looking for sex could find another customer. Someone selling something illegal could conduct business away from the sidewalk. None of that meant every grindhouse was constantly dangerous. It meant the theatres had become unusually permissive public spaces where large numbers of strangers could spend hours anonymously for very little money. By 1960, the deterioration was visible enough that the New York Times ran a front-page article examining life on West 42nd Street and described the area as the worst in town. The problems it identified included vandalism, prostitution, loitering, shops selling weapons or sexually explicit material, and the increasingly troubled grindhouse theatres. That date matters. 1960. The infamous 42nd Street of the 1980s did not suddenly appear because New York experienced a bad decade in the 1970s. People were publicly discussing the decline more than 20 years earlier, and then the economics shifted again. During the 1960s, American laws and court decisions surrounding obscenity began changing. Sexually explicit material could increasingly be sold and displayed in ways that would previously have produced immediate prosecution. Entrepreneurs in Times Square recognized the opportunity. In 1966, 25-cent peep shows appeared in the neighborhood and quickly proved profitable. Customers entered booths and paid coins to watch short films. The model required little space, little staff, and could produce money continuously throughout the day. Other operators copied it. Adult bookstores added viewing booths. Sexually oriented businesses became increasingly concentrated around Times Square. This was one of those moments when a neighborhood could change very quickly, because the new businesses could afford to pay. An adult bookstore did not need to attract families. A peep show arcade did not care whether the block had a good reputation. In some ways, a bad reputation could help. Customers seeking pornography, prostitution, drugs, or other activities they preferred to keep private were not expecting polished surroundings. They valued anonymity. Times Square provided it in enormous quantities. Thousands of strangers moved through the neighborhood every hour. The subway delivered customers. The Port Authority delivered travelers. Hotels supplied inexpensive rooms. The movie houses provided dark interiors. Side streets offered places to disappear from the main crowd. The district was becoming unusually well suited to an economy built around activities people wanted to purchase without being recognized. Organized crime saw the money too. Historical accounts from the Times Square Alliance and Museum of the City of New York describe organized crime moving more deeply into the adult entertainment business around the late 1960s as profits grew. Adult theaters, massage parlors, bars, bookstores, prostitution, and related businesses could produce large amounts of cash, and cash businesses were attractive to criminal organizations for obvious reasons. By the early 1970s, the transformation was difficult to miss. Walk west on 42nd Street and the signs themselves tell you what market the street now serves. Adult films, peep shows, massage, live girls, bookstores, cheap action movies, martial arts films, double features, all-night shows. The old theatres are still there behind those signs. That may be the strangest detail of all. A building constructed for fashionable Broadway audiences could now be showing pornography to customers paying a few dollars. Decorated plasterwork might still exist above an auditorium where hardly anyone bothered to look at the ceiling. A staircase built for people in evening clothes was being used by customers entering a grindhouse. The physical history of respectable 42nd Street had become the container for the new economy of the deuce. It was also during this period that prostitution became increasingly visible on the sidewalks. New York City archival records show that police and city officials were discussing increases in prostitution arrests by the end of the 1960s and attempting broader crackdowns during the Lindsay administration in the early 1970s. Those efforts did not eliminate the trade. There was a simple problem with enforcement. Arresting people did not remove the market. As long as customers continued coming, somebody had an incentive to serve them. Push prostitution from one corner and it could move to another. Close one establishment and another could reopen under a different name. Increase police patrol around one location, and street activity could move several hundred feet away. The police were dealing with a commercial ecosystem, not a single criminal operation. Then, New York City entered one of the worst financial periods in its modern history. During the 1970s, the city's fiscal crisis forced painful cuts and contributed to the sense that basic public order was weakening. Across New York, people saw abandoned buildings, deteriorating public infrastructure, graffiti, service reductions, and rising anxiety about crime. Times Square was not necessarily representative of every neighborhood in New York, but television cameras did not need every neighborhood. They needed one image, and Times Square provided thousands of them. A visitor could emerge from the subway in Midtown Manhattan, only blocks from expensive Broadway theaters and major corporate offices, and encounter prostitution, drug sales, hustlers, pornography, homeless people, deteriorating buildings, and crime almost immediately. It became very easy to use 42nd Street as a symbol for the entire city. Popular culture reinforced that image. Films set in New York increasingly used Times Square because audiences immediately understood what it represented. You did not need 10 minutes of explanation. Show the theatre marquees, show the adult signs, show the crowds, show the dirty sidewalks. The viewer understood that this was the dangerous New York. But again, the block was not deserted. This is what made it so unusual. People kept coming. Some New Yorkers loved the movie theatres precisely because they could see films unavailable anywhere else. The Deuce became famous for kung fu movies, horror films, exploitation films, action pictures, and low-budget productions that developed enthusiastic audiences. Film culture survived inside the neighborhood, even as conditions worsened. There were also restaurants, newsstands, small shops, bars, workers, commuters, and theatre employees who had nothing to do with crime. Broadway itself was still operating nearby. In 1973, the TKTS discount ticket booth opened in Times Square to encourage attendance at legitimate theatres. You could literally buy a discounted ticket to a Broadway show in the same general district where someone else was buying admission to an adult theatre. That contradiction became normal. Respectability and vice did not occupy two separate parts of Manhattan. They shared intersections. A family headed to a musical could pass a sex worker. A commuter could walk past an adult bookstore every morning on the way to work. A police officer could stand beneath a Broadway advertisement while watching a suspected drug dealer across the street. There were enough ordinary people around that the neighborhood never became entirely outside mainstream city life, and enough criminal activity that ordinary people learned to move through it carefully. By the end of the 1970s, the situation had become severe enough that trained observers working with the New York Police Department began systematically recording street conditions in Times Square. Between July 1979 and December 1980, Operation Crossroads documented prostitution, gambling, and other street offences, while examining how different police patrol patterns affected what happened on the sidewalks. The fact that such a program existed tells you how complicated the problem had become. This was not a matter of sending 2 officers to remove a few troublemakers. The police needed to know how behaviour changed by location and time. If officers appeared on one corner, did prostitution move? If patrol numbers increased, did gambling decline? Did offences return when officers left? Which entrances, theatres, arcades and transportation corridors generated the most complaints? Times Square had become something officials were studying almost like a system. At roughly the same time, violent crime throughout New York was reaching historically high levels. A Citizens Crime Commission report found that the city established records for murder and bank robbery in 1979 and was experiencing tens of thousands of reported robberies annually. So the fear surrounding the deuce was now being reinforced by the wider condition of the city. A pickpocket was one concern. Armed robbery was another. For someone unfamiliar with the area, it could be difficult to tell who was harmless, who was selling something, who was running a scam, and who represented a genuine physical threat. Regulars developed instincts. Do not flash cash. Do not let a stranger steer you into a doorway. Do not stand looking confused with your wallet in your hand. Do not assume someone offering help is helping. Know where you're going before you leave the subway. Keep walking. Those habits were passed between people almost like local knowledge. Then came the reputation that helped define the block nationally. In 1981, Rolling Stone described West 42nd Street as the sleaziest block in America. By that point, the Times Square area had already become notorious for the concentration of adult businesses, prostitution, drug activity, hustling, and crime. The Museum of the City of New York notes that by the late 1970s, the district recorded the highest number of felony and total crime complaints in the city, and the numbers could be startling. According to the Museum of the City of New York, more than 2,300 crimes were reported in 1984 on the single stretch of 42nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenues. One block. More than 2,300 reported crimes in 1 year. Not everyone walking there was robbed. Not everyone entering a theatre was attacked. Not every doorway concealed something illegal. But the volume was high enough that danger became part of the street's identity. By now, nobody needed to explain what the deuce meant to a New Yorker. The name carried its own warning, and yet there was still another thing happening here that helps explain why 42nd Street lasted as long as it did. There was money everywhere. Not respectable money necessarily. Not money that appeared neatly in annual reports. But cash. Quarters dropped into peep show machines. Movie tickets sold throughout the day. Rooms rented cheaply. Drinks purchased in bars. Drugs sold in doorways. Sex bought in hotels. Food sold to people who stayed awake until dawn. Pornographic magazines and films purchased by customers arriving from every imaginable background. Even the people running scams depended on the street remaining crowded. The deuce was deteriorated, but it was commercially active, and that meant every theatre, arcade, peep show, bookstore, bar, hotel, restaurant and storefront had people behind it who depended on the neighbourhood, continuing to function exactly as it did. That is where we need to go next. Not simply into the danger, but into the businesses that made the danger possible, and the customers who kept those businesses alive. Because if you walk down 42nd Street in the early 1980s and followed the neon signs through one of those theatre doors, you entered an economy with its own prices, routines, workers, regular customers and rules, all operating inside buildings that had once been constructed for an entirely different New York. Walk through one of those doors in 1982, and the first surprise is how ordinary the transaction can feel. There is a ticket window. There is a price posted somewhere near the entrance. There is an employee behind the glass. You hand over money. A ticket comes back. For a moment, you could be entering almost any old movie theatre in America. Then you look around. The carpet is worn. The lobby has been repainted many times. Old decorative details from another era are still visible above newer signs. A staircase may lead toward a balcony that was built decades earlier for Broadway audiences. Posters advertise movies that respectable suburban theatres would never show. Depending on which building you entered, the programme might include martial arts films, horror movies, low-budget crime pictures, exploitation films, pornography, or several of those categories during the same day. That combination was one of the defining features of West 42nd Street. The deuce was dangerous, but it was also a functioning commercial district. Its reputation depended partly on crime, yet crime alone could not have kept the block crowded year after year. Businesses did that. Thousands of customers came because the streets sold things they wanted, often cheaply, sometimes illegally, and almost always without asking many questions. That is the economy we need to understand. Start with the old movie houses. By the time the 1970s and 1980s arrived, 42nd Street still contained an extraordinary collection of theatres left over from the period when this part of Manhattan had been one of the centres of American entertainment. There were houses with names like the New Amsterdam, the Lyric, the Victory, the Times Square, the Selwyn, and the Apollo. Their histories were different, but many had something in common. They had been built for audiences with more money and higher expectations than the customers using them several generations later. That created an unusual situation. The buildings were too large and too expensive to maintain properly, but many were still capable of making money. A theatre owner did not necessarily need a glamorous audience. He needed paying customers. If a Broadway production required expensive performers, rehearsals, scenery, costumes, musicians, advertising and scheduled performances, a movie theatre could operate on a much simpler system. Get films, open the doors, sell tickets, keep the projector running. On 42nd Street, that model became more aggressive. The grindhouses were designed around volume. Instead of showing one prestigious movie at carefully scheduled evening times, a theatre might offer a double feature or several films and run them repeatedly. Customers could enter throughout the day. Some theatres kept extremely long hours. The exact programme changed constantly, because novelty mattered. A poster that attracted attention this week might be replaced by something more violent, stranger, more sexual, or more sensational the next. For a customer, the value was obvious. You could pay a relatively small admission price and remain inside for a long time. That mattered to many different people. A serious movie fan could watch films that were difficult to see anywhere else. A teenager with several hours to waste could disappear inside. A worker finishing a shift could sit down without spending much money. Someone who had arrived in Manhattan with nowhere else to go could buy warmth, darkness, and a seat for the price of admission. A person who wanted privacy could find it in the rear of an auditorium. Someone interested in an illegal transaction could find hundreds of strangers moving through dim public space. That last part became one of the difficulties of operating the theatres. The management wanted customers, but not every customer was profitable in the same way. A person who bought one ticket and slept for 6 hours occupied a seat but purchased nothing else. A pickpocket could frighten away other customers. A drug dealer might attract police. Sexual activity inside a theatre could create problems for staff, while also being part of the reason some customers came. The employees were left managing a strange balance between maintaining enough order for the business to function and accepting that the atmosphere itself was part of what kept certain customers returning. Projectionists continued to do a real job. Films had to be loaded and changed. Projectors had to operate for hours. Prints could arrive scratched, worn, badly spliced, or already damaged from repeated screenings elsewhere. Ushers and attendants had to move through dark auditoriums that could contain sleeping customers, intoxicated customers, couples, people smoking despite rules, and people conducting business the theatre had never officially agreed to host. Cashiers sat behind protected windows because the entrance itself could become a target for robbery. Managers dealt with police, distributors, landlords, employees, broken equipment, complaints, and a building that might already have been 70 years old. None of this fits the simple image of the Deuce as a place where everybody was committing crimes. A large number of people came to work. Some spent years in those theatres. They knew the regular customers. They knew which seats had problems. They knew when someone entering the lobby was likely to cause trouble. They knew which police officers appeared regularly. They knew when a fight could be ignored for 10 seconds and when it needed immediate attention. They also knew the theatres had changed. A person old enough to remember Times Square before World War II could look around the same auditorium in the 1970s and recognise details from a completely different social world. The old decorative plaster had not necessarily gone anywhere. The chandeliers might still exist even if some bulbs no longer worked. Balconies remained. Private boxes remained in a few houses. Columns, railings, staircases, backstage areas, and dressing rooms survived because tearing them out cost money. The result was not a new building designed for pornography or exploitation movies. It was an old theatre adapting to whatever could keep it open. Pornography became increasingly important because it solved a basic commercial problem. It attracted customers who had a specific reason to come. During the late 1960s and 1970s, adult entertainment expanded dramatically around Times Square. Legal changes made sexually explicit material easier to display and sell than it had been during earlier decades. Entrepreneurs moved quickly. The peep show was especially suited to Midtown Manhattan. It did not require a large theatre. It did not require an audience to arrive at a scheduled time. It did not require an employee to sell a full movie ticket every few minutes. A customer entered, found a viewing booth, inserted coins, and watched a short film or a section of a film. When the money ran out, the image stopped. If he wanted more, he paid again. That was the entire business model. Small amounts of money, collected constantly. It sounds almost insignificant until you imagine enough booths operating through a long day in one of the busiest pedestrian districts in the country. One customer might spend only a little. Hundreds of customers could produce substantial revenue. The machines did not need lunch breaks. The films did not require performers to be physically present. The customer did not need to speak to anyone after entering. And anonymity was one of the product's most important features. A man could arrive from the subway, enter an arcade, spend a few minutes in a booth, and return to the street. Nobody needed his name. Nobody needed to know where he lived. He could be a tourist, an office worker, a salesman between appointments, a commuter waiting for a bus, or somebody who had travelled into Manhattan specifically because Times Square offered things unavailable near home. The Port Authority bus terminal made this especially useful for businesses around the western end of 42nd Street. People were constantly arriving from outside Manhattan. Some had hours before another bus. Some were visiting New York for the first time. Some came from towns where adult bookstores and pornographic theatres were far less visible. Times Square offered those businesses in concentrated form only minutes from transportation. A visitor did not need to search very hard. The signs did the work for him. The signs were important because competition was intense. Imagine several adult businesses operating on the same block. Each one needs the pedestrian passing outside to choose its door instead of the next one. So the language becomes bigger. The photographs become more explicit. Words like live, adult, XXX, girls, peep, and 24 hours appear in large lettering. A customer looking down 42nd Street does not encounter one advertisement. He encounters many businesses shouting for the same dollar. That created the visual landscape later remembered in photographs. Neon did not exist there merely because Times Square had always loved bright signs. It was commercial competition. Every storefront had to announce what it sold quickly enough to catch someone moving with the crowd. Inside the adult bookstores, the economic system continued. Magazines, photographs, films, novelties, viewing booths. In some businesses, live performances became part of the attraction. A customer might pay once to enter and then pay additional money for particular services or viewing time. The important point is that very little space was wasted. A narrow storefront could generate money from several different activities. Cash moved rapidly. That made the adult economy attractive not just to independent entrepreneurs, but to people connected to organised crime. Cash businesses are difficult to monitor from the outside. If hundreds of small transactions occur every day, determining exactly how much money was earned becomes complicated. The business can report one amount and handle another amount privately. Employees can be paid in cash. Suppliers can be paid in cash. Illegal activities can be mixed with legal ones. and when customers themselves value secrecy, they are unlikely to complain about accounting practices. The same environment helped prostitution. A sex worker did not necessarily need a permanent room. The neighbourhood already contained inexpensive hotels and transient lodging. Customers were present. Transportation was nearby. Bars, theatres, arcades and sidewalks provided places to make contact. The arrangement could happen quickly. A person met someone on the street or inside a business, an agreement was made, money changed hands, and the pair moved to a hotel. That meant the hotels participated in the larger economy even when management claimed no direct involvement. Rooms were being rented. Beds had to be changed. Clerks worked the desk. People came and went. A hotel could survive with customers who would never have selected it for a family vacation. The distinction between legal and illegal income became difficult to separate. The hotel room itself was legal. What happened inside might not be. The theatre ticket was legal. The drug sale in the back row was not. The adult bookstore might be operating legally. A different transaction near its entrance might violate several laws. A bar could serve drinks legally while also becoming a meeting place for people involved in prostitution or drugs. This overlap was one reason authorities had such difficulty changing the area. You could arrest individuals. You could raid a particular establishment. You could revoke a license. But the street itself still produced customers. As long as people arrived with cash and specific desires, another business had a reason to serve them. There were also completely ordinary businesses making money from the same crowds. People still needed food. Cheap restaurants and counters benefited from customers who remained in the neighbourhood for hours. A man leaving a theatre might buy a hamburger. A theatre employee needed lunch. A bus passenger wanted coffee. A police officer working the area needed somewhere to eat. A runaway teenager might spend the last few dollars in a fast food restaurant because it was warm and allowed him to sit for a while. Newsstands sold newspapers, magazines, cigarettes, gum, and other inexpensive items. Liquor stores served the local market. Bars collected money from regular customers and strangers. Small retailers sold goods to people who might never return. The street survived because all these economies overlapped. Consider how different customers use the same 24 hours. During the morning, commuters moved through the area. Office workers appeared. Delivery trucks arrived. Theatres and arcades began opening. Employees swept sidewalks and unlocked gates. By afternoon, movie customers mixed with tourists and people coming into Midtown for appointments. School could let out and bring younger people into the district. Workers finishing early shifts appeared. As evening approached, Broadway audiences increased in nearby streets while the Deuce developed a different crowd. Then conventional businesses elsewhere in Manhattan began closing. 42nd Street did not necessarily slow down. For some businesses, nighttime was when the most valuable customers arrived. Bars became busier. Prostitution became more visible. Drug dealing could increase. Theatres continued operating. Peep show customers continued feeding coins into machines. People leaving late buses entered the neighbourhood. Others waited for early morning transportation. The same storefront could therefore serve different populations depending on the hour. This helped make the street resilient. A suburban shopping district might depend heavily on families arriving between 10 in the morning and 8 at night. The Deuce could make money from someone at 2 in the morning. That changed the character of employment as well. Someone had to work those hours. The cashier behind the glass at midnight was part of the street's economy. So was the cleaner entering a theatre after hours. So was the hotel clerk watching people pass through the lobby. So was the bartender. So was the cook standing behind a grill when most of Manhattan was asleep. So was the police officer assigned to the area because all those other people were still outside. The streetscape encouraged another kind of economy too, hustling. The word covered an enormous range of behaviour. A hustler might be selling something legal at an inflated price. He might offer pornography. He might offer drugs. He might claim to know where a visitor could find a woman. He might promise a ticket to a sold-out performance. He He might simply create a story designed to separate a stranger from a few dollars. Some scams relied on speed. The tourist was moving. The hustler approached. A conversation began before the visitor fully understood what was happening. The goal was to create pressure. Maybe there was a supposedly special deal available only now. Maybe the visitor was told a particular place was closed and should visit another establishment instead. Maybe somebody offered to escort him somewhere. The details varied. The economic principle did not. Times Square produced a constant supply of new people who did not know the local rules. That is valuable to anyone running a scam. The most experienced people on the street learned to identify outsiders quickly. A suitcase helped. A paper map helped. Stopping in the middle of the sidewalk and looking at street signs helped. Expensive clothing could help. Even the way someone reacted when approached could reveal whether he understood the neighborhood. The hustler did not need every person to cooperate. He needed one, then another, then another. The street supplied replacements all day. The same was true for pickpockets. Crowds made anonymity possible. A busy sidewalk creates physical contact without immediate suspicion. Someone brushes against your coat. Another person blocks your path. A third moves behind you. A wallet disappears. By the time you notice, the people around you have changed. The subway entrance makes escape easier. The bus terminal makes the victim less certain about where the thief went. A movie lobby provides another crowd. The conditions were almost ideal. Still, many businesses dislike street crime even when they benefited from the neighborhood's rough reputation. A theatre owner wanted people to feel daring enough to enter, but not so frightened that they stayed away entirely. An adult bookstore needed customers with cash. If customers were robbed before reaching the store, that did not help. A restaurant owner needed people willing to sit inside. A hotel wanted rooms occupied. Even some illegal businesses preferred predictable order. A drug dealer did not necessarily want random violence bringing several patrol cars onto the block. A sex worker did not want a robbery occurring near the place where customers were being approached. The deuce therefore developed an odd relationship with danger. Too little danger, and the district might lose part of the anonymity and permissiveness that supported certain businesses. Too much danger, and customers stopped coming. The street operated somewhere between those extremes. Regulars understood that. Tourists often did not. The movie theatres show this balance better than almost anything else. For many New Yorkers, the grindhouses were not simply places to fear, they were fun. If you loved martial arts films, 42nd Street could be one of the best places in the city to see them. If you wanted violent action movies, horror films, strange foreign pictures, low-budget productions or exploitation films that mainstream theatres ignored, the Deuce offered an enormous selection. Audiences reacted loudly. People shouted at the screen, they laughed, they argued, they entered and left while films were running. A double feature could turn into several hours of entertainment for little money. Future filmmakers and film enthusiasts spent time in those theatres and later remembered them not only for danger, but for the variety of movies they encountered. That matters because historical memory tends to flatten places. After redevelopment, the old Times Square was often described either as a nightmare that needed to disappear, or as an exciting lost world destroyed by corporate money. Neither description works by itself. A person could genuinely love the movies on 42nd Street and genuinely fear being robbed outside. A worker could depend on an adult theatre for a paycheck and still hate what the neighbourhood had become. A resident could support police crackdowns and oppose demolition of the old theatres. A tourist could be frightened one night and return deliberately the following week. Different experiences could exist in the same place. The buildings themselves became valuable in another way, as redevelopment discussions intensified. By the 1980s, city and state officials increasingly viewed the deteriorated theatres as both a problem and an asset. The problem was obvious. Some had become associated with pornography, crime, and declining property values. The asset was harder to ignore. These were historic theatres in the middle of Manhattan. Replacing them with ordinary office buildings would erase something that could never be recreated. Preservationists began fighting to save important interiors and facades. Developers wanted profitable uses. Government officials wanted cleaner streets and larger tax revenues. Theatre advocates wanted legitimate productions to return. Property owners wanted compensation. Existing businesses did not necessarily want to disappear. All of them were arguing over the same buildings. That is one reason the transformation of 42nd Street would take years. You could not simply say, remove the pornography and restore Broadway. Who would pay? Who owned the property? Which theatres could be saved? Which businesses had legal leases? What happened to tenants? Could the city condemn buildings? Would developers build during an economic downturn? Would audiences actually return? The street had reached its condition through decades of small commercial decisions, and reversing those decisions required far more than washing the sidewalks. For now, though, the redevelopment plans are still mostly paperwork in government offices. Outside, business continues. It is after midnight. One theatre has just changed programmes. The marquee lights are still on. A few men come through the doors and stand on the sidewalk deciding where to go next. Across the street, another adult business remains open. Someone is arguing with a cab driver. A bus has arrived near 8th Avenue and passengers are spilling toward the sidewalk carrying bags. A woman is standing near a doorway watching the crowd. Two young men have been on the same corner for almost an hour, approaching particular pedestrians and ignoring others. A police car moves slowly through the intersection. Nobody stops what they're doing for very long. The workers inside the theatres know this crowd. The hustlers know it. The dealers know it. The sex workers know it. The police know it. And the people arriving from somewhere else do not. That difference becomes much more important once the ordinary daytime traffic thins, because the juice after midnight belonged increasingly to people who understood exactly how 42nd Street worked, and to people who were about to learn very quickly. By midnight, the balance of 42nd Street began to change. The Broadway crowds did not vanish completely. Neither did the commuters, restaurant workers, theatre employees, bus passengers, cab drivers, police officers, or tourists. Times Square was too important a transportation and entertainment district ever to become truly empty. But as conventional businesses closed, and people who had come into Midtown for an ordinary evening started heading home, another population became easier to see. Some had been there all day, others were only beginning to work. A man stood near the entrance to an adult theatre and watched pedestrians instead of the movie posters. Two young people remained around the Port Authority bus terminal, even though they did not appear to be waiting for a bus. A woman walked the same section of sidewalk several times. Someone offered drugs in a conversation so brief that a passerby might not even realise a sale had been proposed. A teenager sat inside a cheap restaurant nursing a cup of coffee, because the restaurant was warm, and remaining outside meant having nowhere safe to sit. There were hustlers, dealers, sex workers, homeless adults, runaway teenagers, con artists, addicts, night workers, customers, and people whose lives did not fit comfortably into any of those categories. This is where the history of the deuce becomes much more human and much less simple. It is easy to look at an old photograph of Times Square in the 1980s and divide everyone into two groups, criminals and victims. The street did not work that way. A person could be both. A teenager might steal because he was hungry and be robbed himself before morning. Someone selling drugs could also be addicted to them. A sex worker could be breaking the law while being exploited by someone else. A hustler could deceive a tourist and then spend the night trying to avoid a violent customer. A homeless person might know the neighbourhood better than almost anyone while still being vulnerable every time he fell asleep. Researchers studying prostitution and street life in New York during this period repeatedly emphasized that visible street activity developed through networks of people and opportunities rather than through isolated offenders. A 1980 study of prostitution in New York examined how street activity changed according to location, time of day, neighborhood design, police presence, and the different populations using an area. Times Square had almost every condition needed to sustain that kind of street economy. Enormous pedestrian traffic, transportation terminals, inexpensive hotels, entertainment businesses, dark interiors, transient customers, and a steady supply of strangers who did not know one another. After midnight, those conditions became even more important. The Port Authority bus terminal deserves special attention. A bus station does something unusual to a neighborhood. It continually introduces people who have no local connections. Someone could board a bus hundreds of miles away, arrive in Manhattan, step onto 8th Avenue and know nobody in New York. For most passengers, that was simply travel. For a vulnerable teenager, it could be the beginning of something very different. Runaway and homeless young people had been arriving in New York for generations. But Times Square offered an especially powerful attraction. It was famous. It stayed active late. There were inexpensive places to eat. Transportation was everywhere. A young person could disappear into crowds. There were other young people on the streets. There were adults offering money. And that last fact could be extremely dangerous. A federal criminal justice study of juvenile prostitution in Midtown Manhattan found that young people involved in prostitution that came from across the United States. Researchers gathered information from the NYPD, the New York City Youth Board, Port Authority Police, interviews with young people in custody, and direct street observation. Their work showed why Times Square became such an important location for agencies trying to reach exploited youth. Imagine arriving at 17. You have $40, maybe less. Perhaps you left because home was violent. Perhaps you had an argument with your parents and are convinced you will never go back. Perhaps you came looking for excitement and discovered that excitement becomes expensive very quickly when you need food and somewhere to sleep. $40 in Manhattan does not last. One meal becomes several. A room costs money. The subway costs money. Your clothes become dirty. You begin carrying everything you own. After a few days, the city feels different. The buildings are no longer impressive. You're calculating. Where can I sit without being told to leave? Where can I wash? Where is it warm? Who can I trust? How long before someone steals my bag? What happens when the money is gone? On 42nd Street, people were watching for young arrivals who had reached exactly that point. Some offered friendship first. Some offered work. Some offered a place to stay. Some offered food. Some offered drugs. What looked like help could create obligation. Once a vulnerable teenager had no money, no family nearby, no secure place to sleep, and no adult he trusted, the difference between making a free choice and being pressured into survival behavior could become very small. Research from this era into juvenile prostitution found strong connections with running away, abuse, coercion, exposure to prostitution, drug use, and other forms of exploitation. Another 1980 study comparing young people involved in prostitution with other delinquent youths found that family members and pimps played important roles in introducing some of them to the trade. For male youths on the street, the word most commonly heard was hustling. It could mean several things in Times Square, but one meaning was selling sex to men. Research on male prostitution described hustling as an income-producing activity with its own locations, customers, routines, and relationships. Studies also found that young people entering this world were often not simply carefree teenagers making easy money. Histories of abuse, isolation, homelessness, and early coercive sexual experiences appeared repeatedly among the youths researchers interviewed. The environment of Times Square made the market unusually easy to hide in plain sight. Suppose a young man stands near a movie theatre. Hundreds of people pass him. He speaks to one man. Nothing happens, he speaks to another. The second conversation lasts 30 seconds. They walk away separately and meet again around the corner. To everyone else, this looks like ordinary pedestrian movement. The density of the neighbourhood protected anonymity. The Museum of the City of New York has noted that the heavy flow of commuters through Times Square made male hustling relatively easy, because clients could approach or meet young men without attracting much attention. The same transportation system that had made Times Square successful as a theatre district decades earlier now supported a very different marketplace. Female prostitution was more visible in other parts of the district. Women working the sidewalks learned to read potential customers quickly. The customer slowing down in a car, the man who had walked past twice, the person leaving an adult theatre alone, the traveller coming from the bus terminal, the businessman who wanted to avoid being recognised. A conversation could last only moments before the customer and sex worker moved toward a hotel. Hotels were essential. City records from the early 1970s already described numerous midtown hotels as catering to prostitution. Officials tried restraining orders, arrests, enforcement campaigns, and pressure on hotel operators, yet the market continued. Between April and November 1972 alone, the NYPD's Manhattan South Morals district made more than 1,000 prostitution arrests, illustrating how established the trade had become well before the 1980s. By the time we reach the deuce at midnight a decade later, nobody involved needs the system explained. The hotel clerk knows why some rooms are being rented. The sex worker knows which hotels will cause trouble. The regular customer knows where to go. The police officer knows which corners produce complaints. The local restaurant employee recognises many of the same faces night after night. That familiarity is important. 42nd Street was filled with strangers, but it also contained communities of regulars. People saw one another repeatedly. A dealer had customers. A hustler knew other hustlers. A homeless person knew which restaurants tolerated someone sitting for a long time. A sex worker knew who else was working nearby. Theatre employees knew the people who appeared every night without seeming particularly interested in movies. Street knowledge had value. If you had been there for months, you knew which doorway provided cover from rain. You knew which bathrooms were accessible. You knew when the Port Authority became more heavily patrolled. You knew where inexpensive food could be found. You knew which police officers were likely to move people along and which might stop to talk. You knew who was dangerous. You also knew which people only looked dangerous. A tourist had none of that information. This is one reason old descriptions of Times Square can sound contradictory. A visitor might remember one terrifying 20-minute walk and describe the neighbourhood as complete chaos. Someone who spent every night there might describe an organised world. Both could be telling the truth. The order was informal. Nobody had written the rules down. But people learned territory. A dealer could not necessarily stand anywhere he wanted. A sex worker could not assume every sidewalk was equally useful. A con artist needed the right kind of pedestrian traffic. A homeless person sleeping somewhere too visible risked being removed. The businesses themselves created boundaries because employees had reasons to keep certain people away from entrances. Police activity created another set of boundaries. When officers concentrated on one location, the activity might shift a block away. Operation Crossroads, conducted between July 1979 and December 1980, was designed specifically to measure this relationship. Trained observers repeatedly toured Times Square and recorded prostitution, gambling, and other street offences so officials could see how changes in police deployment affected visible conditions. That alone tells you how adaptive the street had become. Move one group and it reappears elsewhere. Increase patrols and activity becomes less visible. Reduce patrols and it returns. An arrest does not eliminate the customer. Closing one location can create demand at another. For the police, the problem could feel endless. For people living on the street, police presence was simply another condition to calculate. Now add drugs. Before crack transformed New York's drug markets in the second half of the 1980s, Times Square already had an open drug trade. Heroin, cocaine, pills, marijuana, and other substances moved through the neighborhood. Drug selling benefited from the same anonymity that helped prostitution and hustling. You did not need a permanent customer base if thousands of people passed your corner. You did not need a storefront. You did not need advertising. You needed customers to know enough to recognize the offer. A dealer might speak directly. Another might use a familiar phrase. A middleman might connect buyer and seller. The transaction could happen in a doorway, theatre, subway passage, hotel, restroom, or simply on the sidewalk. Again, the majority of pedestrians could walk past without participating at all. That is what made the system difficult to see clearly. The illegal economy occupied the same physical space as normal city life. Someone buying cocaine could stand beside someone buying a newspaper. A tourist could ask directions a few feet from a drug sale. A police officer could walk past a theatre while something illegal was happening inside. This was not a hidden criminal district behind gates. It was Midtown Manhattan. The situation became more volatile after crack cocaine entered Times Square in 1986. Crack was inexpensive by the dose, highly addictive, and well suited to rapid street sales. The Museum of the City of New York describes its arrival as a major setback for efforts to reduce prostitution and other disorder in the area, with crime increasing through the end of the decade as crack dealers, addicted users, and homeless encampments became more visible. The effect on street behaviour could be immediate. Someone addicted to an expensive drug needs money repeatedly. That can increase theft. It can increase prostitution. It can increase small-scale dealing. It can make relationships between dealers, users, hustlers, and customers more unstable. Money that might once have paid for a room or food disappears into the next purchase. A person who already had little margin for error now has none. By the late 1980s, crack had become one more reason the street felt different after dark. But it would be a mistake to describe everyone outside at 2 a.m. as part of that world. Plenty of people were simply working. Think about the employees finishing shifts. A theatre cashier locks the booth. A cleaner begins working after customers leave. A restaurant worker takes garbage outside. A bartender ends a shift and walks toward the subway. A hotel clerk remains behind the desk until morning. A Port Authority employee deals with a passenger who missed a bus. A cab driver stops for food. A police officer buys coffee. A newspaper delivery arrives. Nighttime New York depended on thousands of people whose jobs placed them in neighborhoods that other people tried to avoid. For those workers, 42nd Street was not a thrilling excursion. It was the route home. You might finish work at 1 a.m. and know precisely which side of the block you preferred. You might recognize a dealer and simply pass without speaking. You might greet a woman who worked the same corner because you had seen her every evening for 2 years. You might know the homeless man sleeping near a doorway by his first name. Familiarity did not make the neighborhood safe. It made it navigable. That difference is easy to underestimate. The people most vulnerable after midnight were often newcomers. Runaways were obvious examples. Covenant House became one of the organizations most closely associated with trying to reach homeless and exploited young people in and around Times Square. Its Under 21 program operated around the clock, providing food, shelter, clothing, medical care and security to young people who had been living on the streets. A contemporary criminal justice summary described many of the young people reaching the program as having histories of abuse, exploitation, poverty, family disruption, and contact with the juvenile justice system. The program reported serving thousands of youths in a year. That changes the way the sidewalk looks. The teenager sitting near the bus terminal is no longer just part of a colourful scene from old New York. He may be trying to decide whether to accept an offer from a stranger because he has nowhere to sleep. The girl walking with an older man may not be a rebellious teenager enjoying Manhattan nightlife. She may be under somebody's control. The young man joking with friends outside an arcade might be earning money through hustling because those friends are the closest thing he currently has to a support network. The categories blur: victim, offender, worker, runaway, addict, homeless person, hustler. They are administrative words applied to people whose lives could move between categories in a single week. There were also con artists who were neither desperate teenagers nor powerful organised criminals. For them, Times Square was simply good territory. Three-card Monte became one of the classic street games associated with the area. To someone unfamiliar with it, the setup seemed almost laughably simple. 3 cards. Watch the winning card, choose correctly, win money. Win. The trick was that the game was not designed to be fair. The dealer could use sleight of hand. Accomplices could pose as ordinary players, apparently winning money to convince observers that the game was legitimate. Another accomplice might watch for police. The victim thought he was gambling. The people running the game were performing. This was exactly the kind of hustle Times Square rewarded. It was fast. It required crowds. It depended on strangers. And by the time the victim understood what had happened, the group could disappear into pedestrian traffic. Other scams relied less on skill and more on pressure. A supposed theatre ticket, a promised introduction, a story about needing train fare, a fake piece of jewellery, a supposedly stolen item offered cheaply, directions toward a bar or club where the person giving the directions received money for bringing customers. Not every offer was a scam. That was what made the street difficult for newcomers. A legitimate ticket seller and an illegal ticket broker might operate within sight of each other. A person genuinely asking for money and a practiced con artist could tell similar stories. Someone offering directions might be helpful. Someone else might be steering you toward an establishment where you would be pressured to spend money. The only reliable defense was experience. After enough nights, people developed a habit of assessing strangers very quickly. How is he standing? Is he watching me or the whole crowd? Did he approach because I stopped? Is someone else watching the conversation? Why is he offering this? Where does he want me to go? That constant assessment was exhausting, but it became automatic, and there were people who could not maintain it. Someone intoxicated, someone mentally ill, someone extremely young, someone newly homeless, someone arriving from a small town, someone who had been awake for 2 days. Those people were easier targets. Predators understood that. So did police. So did outreach workers. This is why the word dangerous needs to be used carefully when describing 42nd Street. Danger did not mean a stranger jumped from every doorway. Most interactions ended without violence. Most pedestrians completed their trip. People worked there for years. Customers returned voluntarily. Movie fans loved the theatres. Sex workers formed friendships. Homeless people created relationships. Young hustlers could develop a sense of community with one another. Later ethnographic work on Times Square's male hustling population found precisely that. A recognisable community with its own relationships, routines, and understanding of the marketplace, even as AIDS, crack cocaine, policing and redevelopment began breaking that community apart. But the presence of community did not remove danger. It sometimes existed because danger made relationships necessary. If you know the person beside you will warn you when police arrive, that relationship matters. If another sex worker remembers the customer who became violent last week, that information matters. If a theatre employee lets you sit inside for a few extra minutes because it is freezing, that matters. If someone tells you which shelter might take you, that matters. Street survival depended partly on information. The tragedy was that the same networks could also be exploitative. A pimp could offer protection and demand money. A dealer could provide drugs and deepen dependence. An older street figure could teach a teenager how to survive while introducing him to crime. A group could feel like family and still be dangerous. By 3 or 4 in the morning, the distinction between people going somewhere and people who had nowhere to go became clearer. The commuter rush was still hours away. Broadway had been dark for a long time. Many restaurants had closed. The people remaining outside were there because their work continued. Their customers were still present. Their addiction kept them moving, or sleeping indoors was not an option. A teenager might ride the subway because it was warmer than the street. Someone else might try to sleep in a theatre if one remained open. Another person might wait in the bus terminal until security moved in. A sex worker might continue looking for one final customer because the money was expected by someone else. A dealer might have been standing outside for 6 hours. A police officer beginning to recognise the same faces could know perfectly well that removing them from one doorway did not answer the larger question of where they were supposed to go. Then the city begins preparing for morning. Delivery trucks appear, street cleaners move through, early workers emerge from the subway, coffee is poured, newspapers are stacked. The night's population does not disappear at once. It mixes with the day's population. A man who has been awake all night stands beside someone beginning an office job. A runaway teenager watches commuters carrying briefcases. A sex worker finishes work while a theatre employee arrives to unlock a door. The street resets without ever truly stopping. That was part of what made 42nd Street so difficult to control. There was no hour when officials could simply clear the block and start again. The customers kept arriving. The subway kept running. The bus terminal kept producing strangers. Businesses reopened. People who had been moved returned. And every one of those overlapping populations created opportunities for another kind of person who made a living on the deuce. The robber who watched cash change hands, the pickpocket who studied the crowds, the attacker who looked for someone isolated, and the thief who understood that on a street full of strangers, a victim could disappear almost as easily as an offender. If you walked onto West 42nd Street in the early 1980s, the danger was not that one particular crime happened there. The problem was that many different kinds of crime occupied the same few hundred yards. A person worried about being robbed also had to think about pickpockets. Someone avoiding a drug dealer could walk directly into a street scam. A visitor concentrating on the sidewalk might fail to notice what was happening behind him. A teenager trying to avoid the police might become an easy target for somebody more dangerous than the police. The subway entrances, movie theatres, arcades, cheap hotels, bus terminal passages, restaurants, sidewalks and doorways all produced different opportunities. This was one reason West 42nd Street developed a reputation larger than almost any other troubled commercial block in the country. By the late 1970s, the broader Times Square area recorded the highest number of felony and total crime complaints in New York City, according to the Museum of the City of New York. In 1981, Rolling Stone described West 42nd Street as the sleaziest block in America. 3 years later, more than 2,300 crimes were reported on 42nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenues alone. Think about the size of that stretch. We're not talking about an entire neighbourhood. We're talking about one block running between 2 avenues in Midtown Manhattan. That does not mean 2,300 people were violently attacked there. Reported crime covered different offences, and crime statistics never describe every experience on a street. Thousands of people crossed the block without becoming victims. Employees worked there every day. Moviegoers returned repeatedly. Commuters used the transportation system. Tourists walked through. But the concentration was enough to change how people behaved. Someone who knew 42nd Street did not usually stroll through it in the same way a visitor wandered through a quiet shopping district. You moved with a destination. If you needed to stop, you paid attention to where you stopped. You did not leave a wallet hanging carelessly from an open pocket. You did not assume every stranger starting a conversation wanted conversation. You noticed when somebody had been walking beside you longer than seemed necessary. You noticed groups gathered around a game on the pavement. You noticed the entrances to theatres and arcades. You noticed when the sidewalk became less crowded. These habits were not evidence that everyone on the street was dangerous. They were adaptations to a place where identifying danger quickly could matter. Robbery was one of the crimes people feared most because it could begin and end rapidly. The conditions around Times Square made that possible. There were travellers carrying money. There were intoxicated customers leaving bars. There were people emerging from adult theatres who might be reluctant to explain to police exactly where they had been. There were teenagers carrying everything they owned. There were drug customers carrying cash. There were tourists who did not know the geography. And there were crowds large enough for an offender to disappear quickly. The ideal victim, from a robber's point of view, was often someone separated from the crowd without realising it. A busy avenue could feel relatively secure because hundreds of people were present. Turn toward a quieter doorway, hotel entrance, side passage, subway corridor or section of a theatre, and the situation changed. The same neighbourhood could therefore feel crowded and isolated within a minute. That was especially true underground. Times Square's subway passages and the corridors around the Port Authority bus terminal developed their own reputation for crime. The Museum of the City of New York notes that criminal activity flourished in subway corridors and Port Authority passages despite a substantial police presence. The transportation system created a difficult policing problem. People were always moving. A person could commit an offence and board a train. A victim might not even know which direction the offender went. Different police agencies could have responsibilities around transit facilities and streets. Thousands of legitimate passengers had to be allowed to move freely. You could not close a subway entrance simply because pickpockets used it. You could not prevent strangers from entering a bus terminal. Those places existed specifically to bring strangers together. Pickpocketing benefited from the crowds in a different way from robbery. A robber wanted control of the encounter. A pickpocket often wanted the victim to remain unaware that an encounter had happened at all. Times Square gave thieves constant physical cover. Subway stairs compressed pedestrians into narrow spaces. Theatres emptied audiences onto the sidewalk. People gathered around street performers and hustlers. Bus passengers carried suitcases. Tourists looked upward at signs rather than at the people immediately around them. Someone could discover a missing wallet several minutes after losing it, at which point identifying exactly where the theft happened became difficult. Regulars responded with small changes in behaviour. They kept money close. They carried only what they needed. They avoided showing large amounts of cash when buying something. They maintained awareness in crowded entrances. None of these habits made someone invulnerable. They simply reflected the kind of practical knowledge people develop when a particular threat becomes familiar. Then there were the scams. Three-card Monte became one of the most recognisable street hustles associated with Times Square. The appearance was simple enough to attract attention. A dealer manipulated cards while spectators watched and money changed hands. What an inexperienced observer might not understand was that people appearing to be ordinary players could be cooperating with the dealer. The point was not to offer a fair game. The point was to convince an outsider that winning was possible long enough to get his money. The Museum of the City of New York lists three-card Monte and similar confidence games among the activities that became commonplace in Times Square during its decline. The crowds helped again. A small group gathered around money attracts more people. A tourist stops. Someone appears to win. The tourist becomes interested. Police approach, and the group disperses. A few minutes later, something similar can appear somewhere else. For a visitor, the game might look spontaneous. For the people running it, this was work. Other scams were less theatrical. Someone might offer tickets. Someone might promise access to an adult show. Someone might claim to know a cheaper hotel. A stranger might tell a visitor that the place he was looking for had closed, and then offer to guide him somewhere else. A supposed bargain could become a demand for money. Again, the important historical point is not that every stranger was dishonest. The danger came from uncertainty. The victim often had only seconds to decide whether an interaction was legitimate. People accustomed to the deuce learned to end unwanted conversations quickly. Visitors sometimes felt rude doing that. The street rewarded people who got over that feeling. Drug activity added another kind of risk because the transaction itself might be brief, while everything surrounding it remained unstable. Times Square already had a visible drug market before crack cocaine appeared there. Dealers could take advantage of the constant flow of strangers, nearby theatres, hotels, subway passages, and nightlife. Buyers did not necessarily know sellers personally. A transaction could happen, and both people could disappear into different crowds. Then crack reached Times Square in 1986. Its arrival made an already difficult street situation worse. The Museum of the City of New York describes crack dealers, addicted users, and homeless encampments becoming increasingly visible, while crime rose through the end of the decade. Crack changed the rhythm of street addiction partly because purchases could be repeated frequently. A person did not need to disappear into a private apartment for an entire evening. The buying and using cycle could return again and again. For someone already living close to desperation, that created pressure to find more money. The money might come from selling drugs, it might come from theft, it might come from prostitution, it might come from selling possessions, it might come from begging. Different people followed different paths, but on 42nd Street those paths crossed constantly. One person might be selling drugs to someone who had just stolen a wallet. The person whose wallet had disappeared might have been entering an adult theatre. An employee from that theatre might later report a different theft. A police officer responding to one complaint could walk past several other offences that were never reported. This is one reason crime totals tell only part of the story. Not every offence became a police report. Some victims did not want police involvement. Someone buying illegal drugs was unlikely to complain that the dealer cheated him. A customer leaving a prostitute might not want to explain an associated robbery. A runaway teenager might actively avoid authorities. An undocumented person could fear official contact. A person with an outstanding warrant certainly did not want to spend time talking to an officer. People involved in illegal activity were therefore attractive targets for other criminals because they could be reluctant to report what happened. That created what might be called crime inside crime. A drug buyer could be robbed, a sex worker could be assaulted, a hustler could be cheated, a dealer could be attacked. Nobody involved had to be innocent for a serious crime to have occurred. The street could be brutal about that distinction. Violence was another category entirely. Arguments sometimes remained arguments, other times they did not. Alcohol was widely available. Drugs affected judgment. Money disputes occurred. Customers and sex workers argued. Dealers and buyers argued. People competing over territory argued. Teenagers fought. Strangers misread each other. In a densely crowded neighbourhood, one confrontation could attract 20 spectators within seconds. The majority of nights did not turn into continuous street fighting, despite how movies sometimes depict the era. Most people were actively trying to avoid serious violence. Violence was bad for business. A theatre did not benefit when ambulances and police cars blocked its entrance. A dealer did not want officers searching everyone nearby. A sex worker did not want customers frightened away. A restaurant owner wanted customers inside buying food, not watching a fight outside. Even people operating illegally often preferred a predictable street. But nobody controlled all of 42nd Street. That was the problem. There was no single criminal organisation, police unit, landlord, business association, or street group capable of imposing order on everyone else. The block contained too many populations with too many competing interests. This produced a kind of unstable balance. Theatre owners wanted customers. Adult businesses wanted customers. Drug dealers wanted customers. Sex workers wanted customers. Pickpockets wanted distracted customers. Robbers wanted vulnerable customers. Restaurants wanted hungry customers. Hustlers wanted inexperienced customers. Police wanted offenders. Every one of them depended in some way on pedestrian traffic, and the traffic never stopped. That helps explain why visible deterioration could increase fear even when no crime was happening directly in front of someone. A 1985 criminal justice study examining downtown commercial areas found that public disorder such as street drug use and sales, public drinking and loitering strongly affected how people judge their chances of becoming crime victims. Fear changed pedestrian behaviour even when it did not prevent people from visiting an area entirely. 42nd Street concentrated those signals. A person did not need to witness a robbery to feel at risk. He saw the drug sale. He saw someone unconscious in a doorway. He saw an argument. He saw adult businesses lining the block. He saw police officers. He saw people watching him. He saw a group playing a street game for cash. He saw buildings in poor condition. Then someone approached him. The conversation itself could be harmless, but everything he had already observed shaped how he interpreted it. That fear affected legitimate businesses too. Imagine trying to run a normal restaurant on a block where potential customers were nervous about reaching your door. Imagine managing a theatre while parents refused to bring children near it. Imagine operating a hotel whose address itself made travellers suspicious. Businesses suffered from the reputation even when they had done nothing to create it. That created another downward pressure. A conventional business leaves. A less conventional business willing to tolerate the street moves in. The neighbourhood becomes more associated with vice. Another conventional business leaves. The process repeats. By the 1980s, city officials understood that they were not simply fighting individual crimes. They were fighting the reputation of the entire district. That was much harder. An arrest can remove a robber temporarily. It cannot make a suburban family comfortable walking past an adult arcade. A police patrol can clear one corner. It cannot repair a theatre. A raid can close an illegal business. It cannot immediately attract a legitimate tenant willing to pay rent there. Changing the block required altering both actual crime and the public perception of crime. For the people who had to use 42nd Street before that happened, survival remained practical. A woman finishing a restaurant shift after midnight might arrange to walk with a co-worker. A theatre employee could wait until a familiar group was leaving. Someone who knew the neighbourhood might choose a busier route even when it took slightly longer. A commuter learned which subway entrance felt more predictable. A traveller was told not to stop for street games. People avoided displaying expensive jewellery or large amounts of money. Parents warned teenagers away from particular blocks. Cab passengers sometimes asked to be dropped directly at a theatre entrance rather than walking farther than necessary. None of these habits eliminated crime. They reduced uncertainty. People who spent enough time on the deuce also learned something visitors frequently misunderstood. Appearance did not always tell you who presented a threat. The loud person arguing on the sidewalk might never bother you. The quiet man watching the crowd might be looking for a victim. A sex worker standing in a doorway might warn a regular customer that trouble was nearby. A homeless man who frightened tourists might have lived around Times Square for years and know most of the local workers. A clean-cut stranger offering help could be running a scam. Experience meant paying attention to behaviour rather than simply judging clothing. People also learned where help could be found. A familiar cashier, a hotel lobby, a restaurant open late, a patrol officer, a port authority employee, a theatre worker. The same businesses that contributed to the chaotic environment could sometimes provide temporary safety because they were staffed and illuminated. That makes 42nd Street harder to describe accurately. Danger and refuge could be separated by one doorway. Inside a restaurant, you might feel fine. Step outside and someone begins following you. Inside a crowded theatre, you might be vulnerable to theft. Outside in the crowd, you might be safer. Move into a quiet subway passage, and the calculation changes again. The street demanded constant small decisions. One of the clearest signs of how difficult the situation had become was the effort to measure it scientifically. Between July 1979 and December 1980, trained observers working with the Fund for the City of New York and the New York Police Department repeatedly toured Times Square and recorded the type and location of street offences. The programme, called Operation Crossroads, focused especially on visible offences such as prostitution and gambling, and examined how police deployment affected street conditions. Think about what police officials were trying to learn. If officers stood on one block, what changed? Did the activity stop? Did it move 50 yards? Did it return after the officers left? Were arrests actually improving conditions or merely producing arrest statistics? Could officers be placed where their presence had the greatest effect? This was not a small question. New York could put more police in Times Square, but police resources were limited, and the rest of the city also had serious crime. every officer assigned to 42nd Street was an officer unavailable somewhere else. The NYPD therefore had to decide what visible control was worth. There was another complication. A crowded block gives police officers the same problem it gives everyone else. They cannot watch everything. An officer sees a suspected drug transaction and begins following one person. While he does that, a pickpocket works farther down the sidewalk. Another officer questions a street hustler while prostitution continues around the corner. A radio call comes in for an assault. The officers leave. The people who had been waiting for them to leave notice immediately. Street populations watched police as carefully as police watched them. Regular dealers learned patrol patterns. Sex workers noticed which officers were working. Hustlers recognized plainclothes police imperfectly, but tried. People warned one another. Activity changed when uniforms appeared. Then it changed again when the uniforms moved. That does not mean police accomplished nothing. Their presence could reduce visible disorder. Arrests removed offenders. Patrols reassured workers and visitors. Officers intervened in robberies, assaults, disputes, exploitation, and emergencies. People working legally on the block often wanted more police, not fewer. The difficulty was persistence. A police officer could restore order to one corner tonight. What happened tomorrow night? What happened in 6 hours? What happened when the shift changed? By 1982, Mayor Ed Koch's administration was openly concerned about child prostitution around 42nd Street. Records in the New York City Municipal Archives show Koch complaining that the existing response was inadequate and ordering officials to develop a better strategy for protecting minors believed to be involved in prostitution. This was no longer just a question of keeping tourists comfortable. Children were being exploited. Adults were being robbed. Drug markets were operating. Businesses were suffering. The neighborhood's reputation was damaging one of the most visible parts of Manhattan. Everyone agreed something was wrong. Agreement ended there. Some people wanted much more aggressive policing. Others argued that police could never solve economic decay. Some blamed pornography. Others blamed landlords. Some blamed city government. Some blamed the courts for releasing repeat offenders. Some blamed the fiscal crisis. Some blamed suburbanization and changing entertainment habits. Others pointed to homelessness, addiction, lack of services, exploitation, and poverty. They were often talking about different pieces of the same street. A theatre owner saw one problem. A patrol officer saw another. A sex worker saw another. A tourist saw another. A developer saw another. A runaway teenager probably cared very little about any of their theories. He wanted somewhere to sleep. By the middle of the decade, even some improvements did not remove the basic contradiction. City records show that sex-related businesses in the broader Times Square district fell from 96 in December 1977 to 51 by September 1984. And officials pointed to improvements in the hotel market as evidence that clean-up efforts were having some effect. Yet in that same year, more than 2,300 crimes were reported on the single block of 42nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenues. The street could improve in one measurement while remaining terrible in another. That is what makes the early 1980s such an important moment in the history of the Deuce. The old system had not disappeared. The grindhouses were still operating. Adult businesses were still making money. The Port Authority was still delivering strangers. Drug markets remained. Prostitution remained. Street hustles remained. Crime remained. But city officials were no longer treating these conditions as permanent. Plans were forming. Redevelopment agencies were becoming involved. Property was being studied. Historic theatres were being evaluated. Politicians were making promises. And before any of those plans could change the physical street, someone still had to stand outside tonight and deal with what was actually happening. That responsibility fell most visibly on the police officers assigned to Times Square. They walked into the same crowds everyone else was trying to navigate, except they could not simply keep moving when trouble approached. They were expected to recognise the hustlers, find the dealers, respond to robberies, control fights, deal with prostitution, protect tourists, watch the subway entrances, help lost travellers, manage people in mental health crises, answer radio calls, and somehow make one of the most notorious blocks in America behave like an ordinary part of Midtown. And every night, when the officers arrived for another shift on the deuce, many of the people they were looking for already knew their faces. A police officer assigned to Times Square in the early 1980s did not need anyone to explain where the trouble spots were. He could see them. He knew the theatres where complaints appeared repeatedly. He knew the hotels associated with prostitution. He knew the subway entrances where thefts were common. He knew the corners where young hustlers gathered. He knew the men who appeared whenever tourists stopped to watch three-card Monte. He recognised some of the women working the same sections of sidewalk night after night, and many of them recognised him too. That familiarity created one of the central problems of policing 42nd Street. The police were not entering an unknown criminal district and discovering offenders for the first time. They were working inside a neighbourhood where many of the same people returned after arrests, where illegal activity could move when officers approached, and where thousands of completely innocent pedestrians made it impossible simply to seal the area off. West 42nd Street had to remain open. The subway had to run. The Port Authority bus terminal had to receive passengers. Broadway audiences had to reach theatres. Restaurants had to serve customers. Hotels had to operate. Delivery trucks had to unload. Office workers had to get to work. Tourists had to be able to walk through Times Square. The police therefore had to identify illegal behaviour inside one of the busiest legitimate commercial environments in the United States. That sounds obvious until you imagine trying to do it. Stand near 7th Avenue at 10 o'clock at night. Hundreds of people pass in a few minutes. One man speaks quietly to another, and they separate. Was that a drug transaction? A woman approaches a man near a theatre. Is she asking directions? Is she selling sex? Two teenagers stand near a doorway for an hour. Are they waiting for friends? Are they hustling customers? A group gathers around cards on the sidewalk. Is everyone playing? Or are several members of the group working together to trick the one person who thinks the game is real? A man runs out of an arcade. Is he escaping a robbery? Did he commit one? Does anybody inside want to speak to police? This was police work built around observation. Uniformed officers had one advantage immediately. Everyone could see them. That was also a disadvantage. The moment a uniform appeared, behaviour changed. A dealer could stop offering drugs. A sex worker could begin walking. A street gambler could pick up the cards. Someone carrying stolen property could enter a subway station. A hustler could become an ordinary pedestrian until the officer passed. The police did not need to make an arrest for their presence to affect the street. Sometimes simply standing at an intersection was enough to reduce visible activity nearby. The question was what happened 50 yards away. By the late 1970s, city officials were trying to measure exactly that problem. Times Square's repeated clean-up campaigns had convinced authorities that arrest totals alone did not tell them whether the neighbourhood was actually improving. In 1978, the city launched Operation Crossroads as part of a broader Times Square action plan. Police visibility and foot patrols were increased across an area running roughly from 40th to 50th Streets and 6th to 9th Avenues. The NYPD also used undercover female officers in enforcement efforts directed at men purchasing sex. Between July 1979 and December 1980, trained observers systematically toured the Times Square area, recording the number, type and location of visible offences such as prostitution and gambling. Their information was compared with police deployment, complaints, arrests, and the practical knowledge of precinct officers. The purpose was straightforward: determine whether patrol patterns were actually changing street conditions, and use police resources where they produced the greatest effect. This meant somebody could look at a map and ask a question that every patrol officer already understood personally. When the cops stand here, where does everybody go? The answer was often somewhere nearby. Suppose several uniformed officers are assigned to a heavily used corner. For the next hour, the prostitution activity there becomes less obvious. That looks like success. But if the same women begin working around the corner, the activity has not disappeared. It has moved. If gamblers shift closer to the bus terminal, they have not been eliminated. If drug sellers enter a theatre, the market continues. If everyone returns 20 minutes after the officers leave, the improvement existed only while the uniforms were present. This did not make foot patrol useless. Far from it. Visible officers could interrupt crimes, reassure pedestrians, respond quickly to fights, identify regular offenders, assist tourists, and discourage people who preferred locations with less police attention. But maintaining that pressure required officers, a lot of them. New York did not have unlimited police resources. The city was dealing with serious crime far beyond Times Square. A 1980 Citizens Crime Commission report described tens of thousands of robberies annually and record levels of serious violence during the period. Times Square might have been one of New York's most visible problems, but it was not the only neighbourhood demanding attention. So every deployment became a choice. How many officers should stand on 42nd Street tonight? How many should be underground? How many should work plain clothes? How many should be assigned to prostitution? How many should respond to robberies? How many could be pulled away when another part of Midtown needed them? A patrol officer did not have the luxury of concentrating on one type of offence for an entire shift. He might begin by responding to a theft, then a fight, then a complaint from a theatre manager, then an intoxicated person refusing to leave a restaurant, then a tourist reporting a missing wallet, then a young person believed to be involved in prostitution, then someone claiming to have been robbed after purchasing drugs. Each situation came with a different problem. Some victims were cooperative, others were not. Imagine telling an officer that you have been robbed but refusing to explain what you were doing before the robbery. That happened in environments where victims had reasons to conceal their own behaviour. A customer involved with prostitution might not want his family contacted. A drug buyer might not want to admit buying drugs. A runaway teenager might fear being returned home. A person with an outstanding warrant might disappear before giving a statement. An undocumented immigrant could fear authorities. Someone carrying illegal material might decide losing $50 was better than explaining the circumstances to police. That made certain offenders especially difficult to investigate because they deliberately targeted people unlikely to complain. Plainclothes policing tried to solve part of the visibility problem. New York already had substantial experience using officers who did not look like conventional patrol cops. The NYPD's Street Crime Unit, created in the early 1970s, deployed officers in small teams in high-crime precincts and relied heavily on observation and plainclothes tactics. By 1979, the unit had grown to roughly 340 officers and supervisors working in 8 squads across the city. Times Square was exactly the kind of environment where disguise mattered. A uniformed officer approaching a suspected dealer changes the scene immediately. An undercover officer can become part of the scene. He might appear to be a customer. A female officer working prostitution enforcement could pose as a sex worker and wait for a man to make an illegal proposition. Another officer could watch from a distance. Teams could observe a suspected robbery pattern without announcing police presence to everyone nearby. Drug enforcement required similar methods. NYPD narcotics procedures from the period relied on undercover officers or informants making controlled purchases, while backup teams remained positioned nearby. The department's own guidance emphasized how unpredictable those operations could become because of traffic, location, erratic sellers, third parties, communication problems, and the possibility that dealers might rob the undercover buyer. On 42nd Street, those variables multiplied. Traffic was constant. People entered and left buildings rapidly. Subway entrances offered escape routes. Theatres created dark interiors. A dealer might decide not to sell where officers expected, A suspected buyer might suddenly bring another person. Someone unrelated could interrupt the encounter. An undercover officer had to look convincing while knowing that backup could be only seconds away and still unable to reach him through the crowd quickly. The transit system created a separate policing challenge. In March 1979, Mayor Ed Koch responded to concern about subway crime by directing the transit police to increase visible deployment, especially between 6 in the evening and 2 in the morning. Contemporary criminal justice records show how significant that shift was. Increased visible patrol changed arrest patterns enough to affect juvenile diversion programs operating within the transit system. That evening period overlapped almost perfectly with the hours when Times Square was moving from normal midtown traffic into its nighttime street economy. An officer above ground could watch someone disappear down subway stairs and enter another police environment entirely. The station itself was complicated. Platforms, passageways, staircases, restrooms, token booths, crowded trains, connections between lines. A thief could enter one passage and emerge blocks away. A robbery victim might know only that the offender ran toward a train. The Museum of the City of New York notes that crime remained common in the underground corridors of Times Square and the passages associated with the Port Authority, even with large numbers of police in the area. Visibility alone could not solve everything. The same was true with prostitution. Police could arrest sex workers. They could arrest customers. They could target pimps. They could pressure hotels. They could raid particular establishments. The city had been doing versions of all of those things for years. A January 1973 enforcement report showed just how difficult the cycle had already become. The NYPD's Manhattan South Morals District made 1,031 prostitution arrests between April and November 1972. Yet only 92 of those cases resulted in jail terms. Hundreds resulted in fines instead. City officials also identified dozens of midtown hotels associated with prostitution and pursued legal action against some of them. For the officer making the arrest, this could become frustrating. You arrest someone tonight. Paperwork follows. The case moves into the court system. A fine is imposed. Soon the person may be back. From one perspective, the officer has enforced the law successfully. From another, the street looks exactly the same. This is the difference between enforcing laws and transforming a neighbourhood. Police can do the first directly. They cannot accomplish the second by themselves. That became especially obvious with young people. By the early 1980s, child prostitution around 42nd Street had become serious enough to reach Mayor Koch's desk directly. In May 1982, Koch wrote to Deputy Mayor Nat Leventhal after receiving a report from Police Commissioner Robert McGuire. The mayor said he considered the police response inadequate and demanded a strategy for dealing with adults believed to be picking up minors for prostitution. Koch acknowledged the legal limits officers faced when trying to intervene simply because an adult and child appeared suspicious together, but he insisted that vulnerable minors needed protection. Consider the problem from the sidewalk. An officer sees a teenage boy or girl speaking to an older adult. Something feels wrong. But what exactly has happened? Talking is not enough. Walking together is not enough. The officer may suspect prostitution or exploitation, but suspicion is not always sufficient for an arrest. The young person may deny anything is happening. The adult may claim they know each other. Even if police separate them, another customer can appear later. The officer is being asked to prevent exploitation before the evidence becomes obvious enough for normal criminal enforcement. That requires more than handcuffs. It requires outreach workers, shelters, child welfare agencies, prosecutors, courts, social services, places for teenagers to sleep safely, ways to contact families when returning home is actually appropriate, ways to avoid returning a child to an abusive household when it is not. Police officers working Times Square encountered the visible end of problems whose causes were sometimes hundreds of miles away. A 15-year-old might have run from abuse in another state and arrived at the Port Authority. By the time an officer met that teenager, The original family crisis had become homelessness, exploitation, prostitution, drug use, theft, or all of them together. Arresting the teenager could temporarily remove him from the street. It didn't answer what happened the next day. This was one of the reasons officers could become deeply cynical. Police work on the deuce involved repetition, the same corners, the same faces, the same complaints. A theatre manager calls again. A hotel appears in another investigation. A known hustler is back. A woman arrested earlier in the month is working the sidewalk again. A juvenile picked up once has returned. A dealer has moved half a block. A tourist has lost another wallet. The radio keeps talking. The crowd keeps moving. At the same time, regular street populations could become cynical about police. Some saw officers as harassment. Sex workers complained about constant arrest pressure. Young hustlers learned to scatter when patrols approached. Homeless people could be moved repeatedly without being given somewhere permanent to go. People working in adult businesses resented being treated as if every employee were involved in crime. Relations could vary dramatically from officer to officer. One cop might be known for making arrests whenever possible. Another might spend more time talking. One might tell a homeless person to move. Another might know where outreach services were available. An officer familiar with the block could distinguish regular characters from people who had just arrived. That local knowledge mattered enormously. Police departments collect information through reports and databases. Street cops also collect information through memory. Who usually stands here? Who is missing tonight? Who suddenly has money? Who works with whom? Which hotel does that group use? Who is arguing? Which theatre manager complains frequently? Which person is normally loud but harmless? Which person becomes dangerous when drinking? Who is new? A new face on 42nd Street could be more interesting than a familiar one. Regular officers learned the neighbourhood almost like employees of a business. They knew when shifts changed. They knew when theatres emptied. They knew the bus terminal traffic. They knew which hours created particular problems. They knew that rain changed the street because people moved indoors. Cold weather changed it again. Summer heat changed it differently. They knew payday could affect drinking. They knew certain films attracted particular crowds. They knew some people committed crimes only when they needed money. This kind of knowledge rarely appears in crime statistics. It existed in conversations between officers. Operation Crossroads explicitly recognised what reports called precinct law as useful information alongside formal complaint, arrest, and deployment data. Police managers wanted the knowledge officers accumulated through experience to become part of decisions about where resources should go. Still, experience did not eliminate danger for police themselves. An officer entering a fight did not know whether someone carried a knife. A narcotics officer could be robbed during an undercover purchase. A prostitution arrest could turn violent. An intoxicated person might resist. A suspect could run into traffic. Crowds could gather around an arrest and change the situation immediately. Earlier, Midtown prostitution enforcement had already produced incidents in which officers were injured during resistance to arrests, a reminder that even seemingly routine vice enforcement could become physical quickly. There was also the problem of corruption hanging over vice policing historically. New York had a long history of corruption connected to prostitution, gambling, bars, and other cash businesses. Earlier generations of police scandals had shown how easily officers could be bribed when illegal enterprises generated steady profits. By the 1980s, an honest officer working around the deuce understood that history. Cash was everywhere. Adult businesses were profitable, drug money was increasing, illegal operators had strong financial reasons to know when enforcement was coming. The possibility of corruption made supervision and accountability essential, because a single compromised officer could provide valuable information to people running illegal businesses. Most officers were not taking envelopes from pornographers or drug dealers, but the historical association between vice districts and police corruption shaped how New Yorkers viewed enforcement. Suspicion existed even when there was no evidence against a particular patrolman. Then crack cocaine arrived in Times Square in 1986. Whatever progress had been made became harder to see. The Museum of the City of New York describes the crack trade as a major setback to efforts against prostitution and disorder. Dealers, addicted users, and homeless encampments became increasingly visible, and crime continued rising through the end of the decade. For police, crack meant another market operating at high speed. Small transactions, frequent purchases, intense addiction, more competition over locations, users repeatedly needing money. The relationship between drugs, theft, robbery and prostitution became even more difficult to separate. An officer could arrest one dealer, and another person might occupy the same market soon afterward, because customers still existed. That was the recurring lesson of 42nd Street. Demand survived enforcement. By the middle of the 1980s, city officials could point to some genuine changes. The number of sex-related businesses in the broader Times Square district reportedly declined from 96 in December 1977 to 51 by September 1984. Officials also noted improvement in the area's hotel market, yet West 42nd Street remained infamous. The police could reduce visible activity, they could make arrests, they could conduct undercover operations, they could increase foot patrols, they could protect tourists. They could disrupt particular businesses, they could intervene when children appeared to be exploited. They could make one corner safer for one evening. What they could not do was change the economic foundation of the street. As long as deteriorated buildings remained cheap enough for adult businesses, those businesses had somewhere to operate. As long as prostitution had customers, someone had an incentive to sell sex. As long as drugs had buyers, dealers had reasons to return. As long as vulnerable young people arrived without shelter, predators had people to exploit. As long as thousands of inexperienced visitors passed through Times Square, hustlers had targets. And as long as the surrounding buildings continued attracting all of those groups at once, every police shift began with conditions created long before the officers arrived. That is why the eventual cleanup of Times Square required something much larger than policing. The city would have to alter who owned buildings, what businesses could operate, what theatres were used for, how sidewalks were managed, how development was financed, and what kind of customer the neighbourhood was designed to attract. Before that happened, though, 42nd Street remained a workplace, not only for cops, dealers, hustlers, projectionists and sex workers. There were waitresses carrying coffee through late shifts, hotel clerks recognising people without knowing their real names, cleaners entering theatres after the crowds left, newsstand operators who saw almost everything from the same few square feet of sidewalk, cooks feeding people at hours when most of the city was asleep, and ordinary employees who came back 5 or 6 nights a week while newspapers described the place where they earned a living as one of the worst streets in America. To understand what the juice actually was, those people have to be put back into the picture too. The headlines made West 42nd Street sound as though nobody ordinary had any reason to be there. That was never true. Crime statistics could tell you how many robberies were reported. Police reports could tell you where prostitution arrests occurred. Photographs showed adult marquees, broken storefronts, piles of trash, and men standing around theatre entrances. Newspapers wrote about drugs, pornography, runaways and violence because those were the things that made 42nd Street newsworthy. None of those sources could show you what happened at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning when somebody unlocked a restaurant door and started making coffee. They did not show the theatre employee counting change before the first customers arrived. They did not show the projectionist preparing films upstairs. They did not show someone replacing letters on a marquee. They did not show the clerk arriving for an 8-hour shift behind a hotel desk. They did not show the person selling newspapers, the cook working a grill, the cleaner sweeping a lobby, the bus employee giving directions, or the commuter who crossed the Deuce twice every weekday because it happened to be the quickest route between the subway and work. Those people are important because 42nd Street was never an abandoned street. Even during its worst years, it remained intensely active. The Museum of the City of New York describes Times Square during its decline as a place that retained dense and diverse pedestrian activity and continued functioning as a major entertainment and transportation district. That constant human traffic was one reason the area remained commercially valuable even while its national reputation collapsed. So go back to the block in 1983, but arrive earlier than we have before. It is morning. Many of the neon signs are off. That alone changes the appearance of the street. At night, the lights compete for your attention. In daylight, you notice the buildings. Some are dirty, some have neglected upper floors. Old theatre facades sit behind signs advertising businesses that would have astonished the architects who designed them. A few people who spent the night around Times Square are still outside. Workers are beginning to replace them. A delivery truck stops. Boxes come through a doorway. Someone hoses or sweeps part of the sidewalk. A restaurant receives food. Theatres need supplies, hotels need linens, newsstands need papers. The block begins another working day. One of the easiest mistakes to make about the Deuce is to think that a grindhouse theatre operated almost automatically. Put a film in a projector, turn off the lights, and let 42nd Street take care of the rest. A real theatre required people. Someone had to open the building, someone had to sell tickets, someone had to take them, someone had to manage the concession counter, if one operated. Someone dealt with the projection equipment. Someone changed the films, someone cleaned the auditorium, someone handled customers who refused to leave, someone dealt with broken seats, damaged restrooms, complaints, fights, missing property, and all the ordinary problems created when hundreds of people pass through an aging building every day. Years later, when filmmakers began searching for people who could describe the old Deuce from first-hand experience, they specifically sought projectionists, ticket takers, and concession workers who had been employed in the 42nd Street cinemas during the 1970s and 1980s. Even changing the elaborate theatre marquees was regular work that had to be done repeatedly as programs changed. The projectionist occupied an unusual position in this world. Most customers never saw him. He worked above the auditorium in a booth filled with equipment that had to keep functioning through long programs. The theatres of 42nd Street could run double features, exploitation pictures, horror films, martial arts movies, second-run releases and adult films, with programs changing frequently. Old prints were not always in perfect condition. Films could arrive scratched or repaired from earlier screenings. The audience did not care about those technical problems. They expected the movie to appear. If the picture went out of focus, they complained. If the film broke, people shouted. If the screen went dark unexpectedly, the auditorium could become much more interesting than the manager wanted it to be. So somebody upstairs kept the film moving. Downstairs, the ticket seller dealt with another part of the Deuce. One customer at a time, cash through the opening, ticket back, next person. A movie theatre employee could watch the entire population of 42nd Street pass within a few feet. Office workers, teenagers, film fans, men entering adult programs alone. Regular customers recognised immediately. People who looked intoxicated before they entered. People who clearly had nowhere else to spend several hours. People management had thrown out before. People police officers had warned them about. And people whose only interest was seeing two cheap movies. The serious moviegoers are easy to lose when telling this story. 42nd Street had a genuinely important film culture. The grindhouses offered programming that could be difficult to find elsewhere, especially for viewers interested in horror, exploitation cinema, low-budget action, and martial arts films. Cheap double bills made the theatres attractive to people willing to take a chance on films they knew little about. Contemporary accounts of kung fu films in New York describe audiences responding loudly and enthusiastically, and later filmmakers who spent time around the Deuce remembered going there because they actually loved the movies rather than because they were attracted by danger. Director Frank Henenlotter, who spent time in Times Square as a young movie fan and later became known for low-budget horror films, remembered the old neighbourhood as frightening to many outsiders but exciting to him. His recollections are useful because they complicate the reputation of the theatres. He remembered very little serious trouble inside compared with the mythology that later developed around every trip to the Deuce. That does not mean the theatres were safe in any absolute sense. Theft happened, drug activity happened, sex happened, arguments happened, some buildings were filthy, conditions varied enormously from theatre to theatre and from year to year. But a person could enter a 42nd Street grindhouse for exactly the reason printed on the marquee. He wanted to see the movie. If you had been that customer often enough, the theatre became familiar. You knew where you preferred to sit. You recognised employees. You knew which theatre tended to show better martial arts pictures and which one booked horror movies. You knew whether the balcony was worth using. You knew which building was better maintained. You knew where you were likely to be bothered and where management kept tighter control. A place that frightened someone from out of town could become routine to a regular. The restaurants worked in much the same way. Cheap food had been part of 42nd Street for decades. As the grand restaurants of the earlier Broadway era faded, hot dog stands, cafeterias, soda fountains, automats, and inexpensive eating places served the huge working and entertainment crowds around Times Square. Historian Mike Wallace notes that these cheap food establishments became an important part of 42nd Street's commercial life as the theatres moved toward inexpensive, continuous movie programming. By the 1980s, inexpensive food still made sense there. A grindhouse customer was not necessarily looking for a long dinner. A bus traveller might have 20 minutes. A theatre employee needed something during a break. A hustler needed to eat. A police officer wanted coffee. A sex worker might come inside to get warm. A homeless teenager might buy the cheapest item available because purchasing something could give him a reason to remain indoors for a while. The employee behind the counter served all of them. This produced relationships that rarely appeared in newspaper stories. You may not approve of what a regular customer did for a living and still know exactly how he took his coffee. You may know the woman sitting near the window worked the street without knowing her real surname. You may recognise the police officer who comes in during the same shift every night. You may know that the old man in the corner needs several minutes before he can stand. You may know which teenager is likely to ask for leftover food. That is what repeated contact does. It turns categories into familiar faces. The news called someone a prostitute. The cashier knew her as the woman who always ordered coffee. Police called someone a known hustler. A theatre employee knew he disappeared for several weeks and then came back thinner. A tourist saw a frightening homeless man. The newsstand operator had spoken to him every morning for 3 years. This familiarity did not make the street sentimental. People could be harsh. Employees were robbed. Customers caused trouble. Workers became tired of being asked for money. Theatre staff threw people out. Restaurant managers refused to let people sleep at tables. Hotel clerks dealt with customers they did not trust. You could know someone for years without trusting him with your wallet. But human familiarity existed alongside all of that. The adult entertainment businesses had workers too. That fact can disappear behind the signs. A peep show arcade required employees. Adult theatres required managers and attendants. Bookstores needed clerks. Bars needed bartenders. Sex businesses had performers, technicians, cleaners, and people handling money. By 1978, CUNY researchers estimated that Times Square peep shows were grossing between roughly $74,000 and $106,000 per week collectively, evidence of how substantial the adult economy had become. These were not tiny operations surviving on occasional curiosity. There was enough money moving through the district to support businesses, landlords, employees, and criminal interests simultaneously. The people working there did not all have the same relationship with the industry. Some were there because the pay was available. Some became long-term employees. Some moved between jobs. Some performers treated adult entertainment as temporary work. Others built careers inside it. Annie Sprinkle, who arrived in New York as a young woman in 1974 and later became well known within adult entertainment and sex education, was among the former Times Square figures consulted decades later, when television producers tried to reconstruct the deuce accurately. The researchers behind that project sought out former sex workers and other people who had actually spent time in the neighbourhood, because ordinary first-hand memories contain details official records did not. Those memories reveal a 42nd Street built from overlapping communities. The adult theatres had their regulars, the grindhouses had theirs, bars had regular customers, street sex workers knew one another. Male hustlers knew other hustlers, dealers knew buyers, restaurant workers recognised police, police recognised hotel employees recognised customers. The same faces crossed different parts of the block. A person might be known in 3 theatres and 2 bars without anyone knowing where he lived. Another might appear every weekday at precisely the same time because he was changing subway lines on his way home. Not everyone considered themselves part of the deuce. For commuters, it could simply be an obstacle between 2 destinations. Times Square's importance as a transportation hub did not decline with its reputation. The subway had helped create the theatre district in the first place, and the Port Authority bus terminal added huge numbers of travellers to the west side of the neighbourhood. The district retained its power partly because that pedestrian traffic never disappeared. This created one of the strangest sights on 42nd Street. People who looked completely uninterested in the neighbourhood moved through people who had built their entire lives around it. A secretary finishing work walked past a man who had hustled outside the same theatre for 10 years. A bus passenger carrying luggage crossed paths with a projectionist heading into work. A Broadway audience moved near customers headed toward adult theatres. A family passed someone selling drugs. A police officer stood beside an office worker waiting for a light to change. For a few seconds, everybody shared the same curb. Then they separated. One of the most important groups of regulars belonged to communities that had fewer welcoming public spaces elsewhere. Times Square had a long history as a meeting place for gay men, and the visibility of gay life in the district was already attracting public attention by 1960. After the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, the Gay Liberation Front marched in Times Square, connecting the neighbourhood to a much larger transformation in gay public life. The adult theatres, bars, streets, and transportation corridors around Times Square also became meeting places for men seeking other men. Some encounters involved prostitution, others did not. Some people came because anonymity allowed behaviour they concealed elsewhere. A married man from outside Manhattan could travel into Times Square, spend several hours there, and return home without anyone in his neighbourhood knowing where he had been. A young gay man could encounter people like himself in ways that were much harder in a small town. That did not make the Deuce a safe community centre. Police pressure, robbery, exploitation and violence were genuine risks, but people used the spaces available to them, not the spaces historians wish they had possessed. By the middle of the 1980s, AIDS changed this world profoundly. A 1985 Village Voice account based on conversations with male hustlers and people around Times Square described a community increasingly aware of illness, changing sexual behaviour, drug use, and the risks facing people who had survived through prostitution and street life. The article's subjects still joked, argued, worked, used drugs, worried about money, and looked after particular friends even while AIDS was becoming impossible to ignore. Reading accounts like that makes the Deuce look different from a police photograph. People did not stop having ordinary concerns because they occupied an extraordinary place. They worried about rent, they wanted relationships, they became jealous, they complained about co-workers, they borrowed money, they lost friends, they got sick, they wanted better jobs, they promised themselves they would leave. Some did not. A man could spend years working around 42nd Street and still believe he was only there temporarily. The hotel employees saw another side of this population. A cheap midtown hotel could receive travellers, prostitutes and customers, people between permanent apartments, people who wanted anonymity, and people who simply needed an inexpensive room. The clerk at the desk occupied a position similar to the theatre cashier. Everyone eventually passed him. He learned when not to ask questions. He learned when he needed to ask questions. He knew which guests paid. He knew which rooms caused complaints. He knew which people were not officially registered but appeared regularly anyway. He knew when police were likely to arrive. He knew that the same room could be used by entirely different people across a single week. Then, there were the people whose businesses sat just outside the crime stories. Shoeshine men, news vendors, bartenders, small shop employees, street vendors, people selling inexpensive goods. The neighbourhood could be visually chaotic, but the person running a stand often occupied nearly the same position for hours. That gave him an unusual view. Everybody else moved. He stayed. By lunch he had seen the morning shift. By evening he had watched tourists arrive. By midnight he knew who was still outside. The local regular is one of the hardest people to reconstruct historically, because being ordinary leaves fewer records. Police arrest reports preserve the person arrested. Newspapers preserve the victim of an unusual crime. Government redevelopment files preserve property owners. Court records preserve defendants. The man who sold newspapers for 20 years may leave almost nothing. The woman who cleaned a theatre restroom does not appear in the history of Times Square unless someone happened to interview her. The cook who made thousands of meals can vanish from the record. Yet the neighbourhood could not have operated without people like them. The same problem affects how we remember the customers. Photographers naturally aim their cameras toward unusual faces and dramatic signs. They did not necessarily photograph the accountant who crossed the street every evening without incident. That man may have walked the deuce thousands of times. He is part of its history too. The existence of these ordinary routines also explains why later redevelopment produced complicated emotions. It is easy to understand why city officials wanted crime reduced. It is easy to understand why parents did not want children walking through open drug markets. It is easy to understand why theatre advocates wanted historic buildings rescued before decay destroyed them. It is easy to understand why businesses wanted customers who were not frightened to visit. But changing a neighbourhood does not remove only statistics, it removes routines. A cleaned-up theatre may mean a projectionist loses the job he has held for 15 years. Closing an adult arcade eliminates a business someone depended on for wages. A hotel redevelopment removes both dangerous activity and the room of a person who had nowhere else affordable to live. A police sweep may make tourists more comfortable while scattering a street community whose members had been watching one another for years. None of that means the old Times Square should have remained unchanged. It means urban change always happens to actual people. By the later 1980s, people working on 42nd Street were beginning to live beside signs that the future of the block would not be decided by them. Redevelopment plans had been gathering force for years. State and city officials wanted 42nd Street transformed. Property battles, lawsuits, preservation arguments, and development proposals were moving through offices far removed from the ticket booths and food counters. The city had already spent years trying to reduce vice businesses, while major redevelopment proposals presented the street as a problem requiring intervention on a scale much larger than routine policing. For the worker arriving in the morning, most of that could still feel distant. The theatre opened. The register needed counting. The coffee needed making. The marquee needed changing. The bus passengers kept coming. The regular customers returned. The police officer walked the block. The same man stood near the same doorway. But individual buildings were beginning to close. The Liberty Theatre, after decades of movie operation, closed to the public in the late 1980s. Other historic theatres were moving toward an uncertain period in which their value as real estate, architectural landmarks, and potential entertainment venues mattered more to planners than the businesses currently operating inside them. Then, in 1990, New York City and New York State created an organization that would eventually take responsibility for 7 of the historic theatres on this single block. What became New 42 was established specifically to revive West 42nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenues, and its creation marked the point when decades of proposals started becoming a different kind of reality. The people already on the street did not disappear the day the organisation was created. The old businesses were still there. The lights still came on, customers still arrived, people still worked their shifts. But now the question was no longer whether somebody would eventually try to remake the Deuce. The question was what would remain once they succeeded. There was no single last night on the Deuce. No official stood at 7th Avenue, waited for midnight, and announced that the old 42nd Street was over. No final grindhouse switched off its marquee, while everybody around it understood that an era had ended. The street disappeared gradually. One business closed. One theatre changed hands. One building was condemned. Another was renovated. Police tactics changed. Landlords saw new opportunities. Adult businesses encountered new restrictions. Large companies that would once have avoided Times Square began signing leases. The crowd changed with them. Eventually, enough of those changes accumulated that the West 42nd Street people remembered from the 1970s and 1980s could no longer reproduce itself. The process had actually begun while the Deuce was still near the height of its notoriety. In 1980, New York City and the New York State Urban Development Corporation formally began what became the 42nd Street Development Project. The original concept was enormous. Officials wanted to eliminate what they described as blight, encourage commercial development, renovate the subway station, preserve historic theatres, add retail and restaurants, and construct major new office towers around Times Square. The New York City Board of Estimate approved the project in November 1984 after years of planning, environmental review, public hearings, and opposition. Imagine hearing about that plan while working inside one of the old theatres. Outside, almost nothing changes immediately. The movie still starts, the ticket booth still opens, a dealer still stands near the corner, the peep show still collects money, the same restaurant still sells coffee. Government redevelopment plans can appear very powerful on paper and very distant from the people who occupy the buildings those plans describe. That distance helped the old Deuce survive longer than many officials expected. The redevelopment project became tangled in lawsuits, condemnation proceedings, disagreements over architecture, preservation battles, financing problems, and changing economic conditions. The original strategy depended heavily on large office towers, helping finance improvements elsewhere in the district. During the 1980s, officials imagined millions of square feet of new office space acting as an economic anchor for the neighbourhood. But New York's real estate market did not cooperate neatly. By the end of the decade, the office market weakened and the economy entered a downturn. Plans that had looked financially convincing several years earlier became much harder to execute. That meant the transformation of 42nd Street would not happen according to one master blueprint. Instead, it would happen through a collection of smaller decisions. The theatres became one of the most important parts of that strategy. This made sense because the old theatres were both the problem and the opportunity. They were associated with everything officials wanted to change: second-run movies, pornography, poor maintenance, loitering, crime around entrances, buildings that appeared to confirm the neighbourhood was collapsing. But underneath the dirt and alterations were historic interiors, created during the period when 42nd Street had been one of America's premier theatre districts. Destroying all of them would solve one problem by creating another. New York would lose buildings that could never be replaced. The solution that eventually emerged was unusual. In 1990, New York City and New York State established a non-profit organisation then called the New 42nd Street. Its job was to find new uses for 7 historic theatres on the block: the Apollo, Empire, Liberty, Lyric, Selwyn, Victory and Times Square theatres. In May 1992, the organisation signed a 99-year master lease covering those properties. Think about what that meant physically. The old theatre buildings were still there. but their future was no longer controlled by the same market that had turned many of them into grindhouses and adult venues. A different institution was now deciding what kinds of uses should occupy them. That is one of the clearest moments when the economics of the deuce began to break. For decades, the street had adapted downward because cheaper forms of entertainment could pay enough rent to survive there. Pornography worked, second-run films worked, adult arcades worked, businesses serving transient customers worked. Suddenly, preservation groups, government agencies, non-profit organisations and major developers were asking whether the same buildings could support something far more profitable. The Victory Theatre provided an almost perfect demonstration. It had opened in 1900 as the Republic Theatre and spent part of its early history hosting legitimate stage productions. It later became a burlesque house, then a movie theatre, and by the early 1970s became the first pornographic movie theatre on 42nd Street. The building had followed nearly the entire history of the block, then its direction reversed. New 42 restored the theatre and reopened it on December 11, 1995 as the New Victory Theatre, devoted to performances for children and families. The symbolism was impossible to miss. A theatre that had shown pornography was now asking parents to bring children through the same doors. That required more than renovating the auditorium. Parents had to believe they could walk there safely. Families needed places to eat. The sidewalks needed to feel manageable. Businesses around the theatre had to complement the new audience rather than frighten it away. Changing one theatre therefore created pressure to change everything around it. Around the same period, the neighbourhood acquired another institution interested in basic street conditions. The Times Square Business Improvement District, now called the Times Square Alliance, was founded in 1992. It provided services related to sanitation, public safety, economic development and promotion throughout the district. That may sound less dramatic than a major police operation. It was not. Street cleaning matters enormously in a commercial district. So does removing graffiti, so does having visible security personnel, so does helping visitors, so does convincing property owners that someone is responsible for what happens outside their front door. For years, Times Square had suffered from the opposite effect. A dirty sidewalk told customers that nobody cared. A neglected storefront encouraged another owner to spend less. A frightened customer stayed away. The remaining businesses became increasingly dependent on people willing to tolerate the conditions. That reinforced the decline. The new strategy attempted to reverse that process. Make the street cleaner, make it feel safer, attract more visitors, give conventional businesses more customers, increase the value of the property, make investment more attractive. As rents and expectations rise, businesses that depended on cheap, deteriorated space become harder to sustain. Police activity remained important during this period, but it was now operating alongside economic redevelopment rather than being expected to solve the street by itself. That distinction matters because the cleanup of Times Square is sometimes reduced to a simple story in which Mayor Rudolph Giuliani became mayor in 1994, sent in the police, and transformed the neighbourhood. Crime reduction during the Giuliani administration was a major part of the story, but the physical redevelopment of 42nd Street had started years earlier under Mayor Ed Koch and continued under Mayor David Dinkins. The 42nd Street development project began in 1980. The Board of Estimate approved the redevelopment plan in 1984. New 42 was created in 1990, and the Times Square Business Improvement District was established in 1992. Giuliani inherited a transformation already underway. His administration accelerated important parts of it. Policing became more assertive. Quality of life offences received more attention. City agencies became increasingly willing to challenge businesses regarded as harmful to surrounding neighbourhoods. The most important blow to the adult entertainment economy came not from officers arresting customers outside a peep show, but from zoning law. New York City had historically regulated adult establishments largely under the same basic zoning framework as other commercial businesses. That changed in the 1990s. The Department of City Planning began studying adult establishments in 1993. Its 1994 study concluded that concentrations of adult businesses were associated with negative effects including higher crime, reduced property values, weaker commercial activity, and deterioration of neighbourhood character. In October 1995, the City Council adopted permanent zoning restrictions aimed at adult establishments. The rules prohibited them in residential districts and many commercial and manufacturing districts. Where adult businesses remained permitted, they generally had to stay at least 500 feet from schools, daycare centres, houses of worship, residential districts, and other adult establishments. The regulations were challenged in court. Owners argued that the restrictions violated constitutional protections for expression. The city argued that it was regulating where businesses could operate because of their secondary effects on neighbourhoods, not outlawing adult expression itself. Litigation continued for years, but the 1995 framework survived major constitutional challenges. For Times Square, the practical consequence was enormous. The adult businesses had benefited from concentration. A customer could arrive knowing that theatres, bookstores, arcades, prostitution, hotels and related businesses existed within a compact area. That concentration helped create the deuce. The zoning strategy attacked concentration itself. Even businesses that survived faced another problem. The neighbourhood around them was becoming more expensive. An adult theatre could compete successfully with another cheap theatre. It had much more difficulty competing for midtown real estate with major corporations, hotels, national retailers, restaurants, and entertainment companies. Nothing demonstrated that shift more clearly than Disney. The New Amsterdam Theatre stood just east of the group of 7 theatres controlled by New 42. Once one of Broadway's most elaborate houses, it had become a movie theatre in 1937 and later fell into severe disrepair. By the early 1990s, the building was in terrible condition. Disney became interested in the property as it expanded into Broadway theatre. Negotiations began in 1993, and the company eventually committed to restoring the New Amsterdam in partnership with city and state redevelopment efforts. The restored theatre was officially unveiled in April 1997 and returned to live performance that May. Later that year, Disney's The Lion King opened there. Disney's arrival did not single-handedly clean Times Square, but it changed expectations. If one of the largest entertainment companies in the world was willing to invest on 42nd Street, other companies could begin imagining themselves there too. That mattered to landlords. It mattered to lenders. It mattered to developers. It mattered to tourists. It mattered to parents deciding whether to bring children into Midtown. The neighbourhood was beginning to acquire a different kind of customer, and customers determined streets. For the old deuce, that was fatal. The peep shows had depended on one population. The grindhouses depended on another. Street prostitution depended on another. Hustlers depended on tourists who were uncertain and vulnerable. Drug dealers depended partly on a street where illegal commerce could blend into disorder. Cheap hotels depended on customers who valued low prices and anonymity more than comfort. Once mainstream businesses wanted the same real estate, the balance changed. Consider the Empire Theatre. The old Eltinge Theatre had opened in 1912 and later spent decades as a movie house. In 1996, New 42 reached an agreement with developer Forest City Ratner, involving the Empire and Liberty Theatres as part of a major entertainment complex. The solution for the Empire was extraordinary. The historic structure sat where redevelopment plans needed something else, so they moved the theatre. On March 1st, 1998, the Empire was placed on a specially designed track and shifted 168 feet west along 42nd Street. It eventually became the entrance to the AMC Empire 25 multiplex, which opened in 2000. A building that had once represented the old movie culture of the Deuce was physically rolled down the street to become part of a modern multiplex. You could hardly design a better demonstration of what was happening. The old structures were not always destroyed. They were absorbed into a new economy. Something similar happened with the Apollo and Lyric. Both had long histories extending back to the theatre district's early years. By the 1970s, both had shown X-rated films at various points. In the redevelopment era, they were combined into a large modern Broadway house. Construction began in 1996, and the merged theatre opened at the end of 1997 with the musical Ragtime. The Selwyn followed another complicated path. New 42 leased it for use by the Roundabout Theatre Company in 1997. Then part of the adjoining building unexpectedly collapsed in December of that year, forcing a redesign. The reconstructed theatre eventually reopened in 2000. By then, the transformation was impossible to dismiss as another temporary clean-up campaign. Major capital had arrived. Theatres were being rebuilt. National entertainment companies were signing agreements. Families were coming to the new Victory. Disney had restored the new Amsterdam. A large multiplex was under construction. New restaurants and retailers were appearing. Corporate offices were moving into the district. The audiences standing on the sidewalk were changing. And when the audience changes, the surrounding economy changes with it. Imagine a theatre cashier from 1983 returning to the same block around the end of the 1990s. The street grid is identical. 7th Avenue is still there. 8th Avenue is still there. The subway still arrives underneath. The old theatre facades remain in places, but the businesses no longer make sense according to the rules he remembers. A pornographic movie house has become a children's theatre. Disney occupies the new Amsterdam. Another historic theatre has been physically moved. 2 others have been joined together for a Broadway musical. Security and sanitation are more visible. Large companies advertise where adult businesses once competed for attention. Tourists still stop and look around, but now the neighbourhood is deliberately designed to make them stay. That is when you realise the old 42nd Street has ended. Not because every person from the earlier world disappeared. They did not. Drug use did not disappear from New York. Prostitution did not disappear. Homelessness did not disappear. Crime did not disappear. Adult entertainment did not disappear from the city. Many activities moved elsewhere, became less visible, adapted to regulation, or changed with technology. The people who had depended on the old street also did not simply cease to exist. Some workers found other jobs. Some businesses relocated. Some street populations moved to other neighbourhoods. Some people entered shelters or services. Some were incarcerated. Some died. Some simply grew older and watched a neighbourhood they understood become a place designed for someone else. That is the part redevelopment statistics cannot easily measure. A city can count crimes. It can count tourists. It can count hotel rooms. It can count property values. It has a much harder time counting familiarity. The old use had been dangerous, exploitative, dirty, and in many respects deeply damaging. Children were exploited there. People were robbed there. Addiction destroyed lives there. Businesses suffered because customers were afraid to visit. Historic theatres decayed because owners lacked either the money or incentive to restore them. There were powerful reasons to change it. There were also people who remembered things worth remembering. The double features, the kung fu audiences shouting at the screen, the projectionists who kept ancient equipment operating, the cheap restaurants, the night workers who knew one another, the strange mixture of people who would never normally share the same room, the ability to see movies no suburban multiplex would touch, the feeling that almost anything could happen within a few hundred yards. When redevelopment removed the danger and disorder, it also removed much of that unpredictability. That trade remains at the centre of arguments about Times Square. Was the neighbourhood rescued? Yes, in many important ways. Was something lost? Also, yes. Those two statements do not cancel each other out. The people who wanted a cleaner and safer Times Square were responding to real conditions. The people who later complained that Times Square had become overly corporate were responding to real changes too. Cities rarely offer the luxury of preserving every quality people find interesting, while eliminating every quality that makes life difficult. Walk down West 42nd Street after the transformation and the old block survives mainly in pieces. A theatre facade, a restored auditorium, an old photograph, a movie poster, someone's memory of paying a few dollars for a double feature, the recollection of an officer who worked the same corner every night, a former sex worker remembering who stood beside her, a projectionist remembering the audience yelling when the film broke, a clerk remembering faces whose names he never learned. The official redevelopment organisations left their own record. New 42 was founded in 1990 specifically to revive the historic theatres between 7th and 8th Avenues, and its restored New Victory became one of the first visible demonstrations of the new direction in 1995. By the end of the decade, major theatre, retail, entertainment and office projects were operating or under construction across the block. The old Deuce therefore did not die in one police raid or one mayoral announcement. Its disappearance took almost 2 decades of planning, condemnation, litigation, preservation, policing, zoning, private investment, non-profit work, changing crime levels, rising property expectations, and repeated decisions about what kind of street New York wanted 42nd Street to become. That is why looking at photographs from 1980 and photographs from the end of the 1990s can feel as though they show 2 different cities. They do not. They show the same block under 2 different economic systems. In one, cheap theatres, pornography, transient hotels, drugs, prostitution, street hustling and low rents reinforced one another. In the other, restored theatres, family entertainment, corporate tenants, tourism, chain retail, private security, sanitation, and rising investment reinforced one another. Once the second system became stronger than the first, the Deuce could no longer survive in the form people remembered. If you had walked there on one of those ordinary nights in the early 1980s, you would not have known any of this was coming. You would have seen the adult signs. You would have heard the traffic. You might have watched somebody selling tickets behind thick glass. A police officer would pass. A dealer would wait for him to move on. A movie would begin inside one of the old theatres. Someone arriving from the Port Authority would stop and look around because he had never seen anything like 42nd Street before. The people working there would behave as though tomorrow would look much like today. For a while it did. Then enough tomorrows passed. Enough buildings changed hands, enough doors closed, and enough different customers arrived that one of the most infamous streets in 20th century America became something else. And the next time somebody tells you Times Square used to be different, you now know just how much history is hidden inside that sentence.